My daughter-in-law and her wealthy parents smashed my birthday gift to my son right in front of everyone. They laughed as I stood there, a 72-year-old black man looking like the hired help in a room full of millionaires. They thought they put me in my place. But then my son walked in, looked at his father-in-law, and said 5 words that made the entire room go dead silent. "You just bankrupted your family. They never saw it coming. My name is Nathaniel Rollins." Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their arrogant little world piece by piece, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned and not bought, and if you love seeing toxic people get exactly what they deserve. I stepped into the grand foyer of the sprawling estate, the heavy oak doors closing behind me. It was my son Julian's 35th birthday. Julian had grown into a brilliant, ruthless corporate attorney, a man I was immensely proud of. But this party was not really thrown for him. It was a vanity project, a lavish, unnecessary spectacle organized by his wife Chloe. The massive living room was filled with elite old money white folks holding crystal champagne flutes. They were talking about their summer homes in the Hamptons and complaining about capital gains taxes. I stuck out like a sore thumb. I am a 72-year-old black man who spent his entire youth covered in engine grease sweating in factories during an era when men who looked like me were expected to stay out of sight. I was wearing my best pressed slacks and a simple brown corduroy jacket. I did not need to wear a $5,000 tuxedo because I know exactly who I am and what I have built. I held a small wooden box carefully in my rough hands. Inside was a vintage silver pocket watch. It belonged to my father and his father before him. I had spent the last 6 months in my small workshop, hunched under a magnifying glass, carefully restoring every tiny gear and spring so Julian could have a piece of our family history. As I walked toward the center of the room to find my son, a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down on my shoulder, I turned around. It was Richard, Chloe's father. Richard owned a mid-sized manufacturing firm. He carried himself like he was the king of the world, constantly radiating that specific type of arrogant privilege that assumes everyone else in the room is beneath him. He always looked at me with a thin, condescending smile, treating me like I was a charity case his daughter had to tolerate. "Well, if it isn't the handyman," Richard boomed. His voice was intentionally loud, designed to make the nearby guests turn around and stare at us. "You actually showed up, Nate. I am honestly surprised the valet let you park your old truck in the driveway." Before I could respond, Chloe rushed over. Her expensive silk dress rustled as she moved. She looked at me with a flash of pure embarrassment, her eyes scanning my simple clothes with absolute disdain. "Oh my God, Dad, leave him alone." Chloe laughed, though there was absolutely no warmth in her voice. She turned to me, crossing her arms. "Nate Julian is busy networking with real executives right now. What is that in your hands? Please tell me you did not bring another one of your cheap DIY crafts to my upscale event." I kept my posture perfectly straight. I kept my voice calm and even. "It is a family heirloom for my son," I said, holding out the wooden box. "I restored it for his 35th birthday." Richard snatched the box from my hands before I could even open the latch. "Let us see what the working class considers a treasure these days," he sneered. He flipped the box open. The polished silver watch gleamed beautifully under the chandelier lights. But Richard did not see history. He did not see the hundreds of hours of labor I had poured into it. He only saw an opportunity to humiliate a man he felt superior to. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed across the room. "An old broken clock," Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Julian wears a Rolex, Nate. He does not need your scrap metal. We actually buy him things with value." Richard casually flicked his wrist. The box and the silver watch tumbled from his hands. It hit the hard marble floor with a sharp, sickening crack. The silver casing popped open. The tiny gears and springs I had spent months meticulously cleaning scattered across the polished stone. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I did not break my composure. But Richard did not stop there. He looked me dead in the eyes, a cruel, cold smile spreading across his face. He took a deliberate step forward and brought the heel of his expensive Italian leather shoe directly down on the face of the watch. The antique glass shattered. The metal bent and warped under his weight. He ground his heel into it, twisting his foot like he was putting out a cigarette. "Oops," Richard said, shrugging his shoulders with a theatrical sigh. "Clumsy me. Looks like this junk belongs in the trash where it came from. Do not worry, old man. I will buy Julian a real gift tomorrow with my own money. I looked at Chloe, expecting at least a shred of human decency from the woman married to my son. But Chloe did not gasp. She did not apologize. She threw her head back and laughed. Several of her wealthy friends standing nearby joined in sipping their champagne, looking at me like I was the punchline to a very pathetic joke. Chloe sighed, waving her manicured hand dismissively toward the back of the house. You are making a scene and bringing the mood down. Why do you not go down to the kitchen? The catering staff is having their break right now. Get yourself a plate of food and stay out of the way. We have important people here tonight and you are embarrassing me. They expected me to yell. They expected me to lose my temper to give them the angry reaction they could use to call security and have me thrown out into the street. They expected me to shrink to cry or to leave in complete shame. But a man who has survived the darkest days of this country and built a silent empire does not need to throw a tantrum. A man who holds all the cards does not need to flip the table. He just waits for the game to end. I did not say a single word. I slowly got down on one knee. My 72-year-old joints ached, but I ignored the pain. I reached out and carefully picked up the crushed silver casing. I picked up the shattered glass. I picked up the bent hands of the clock. I put every broken piece back into the little wooden box and stood up. I looked at Richard. I looked at Chloe. I let them enjoy their arrogant little victory. I let them drink their champagne and feel like they were untouchable gods. They thought they had just crushed a broke, useless old mechanic. They had no idea they had just declared war on the man who secretly held the patents that kept Richard's entire manufacturing company alive. I closed the wooden box, slipped it into my coat pocket, and took a step back into the shadows of the grand room. I did not go to the kitchen. I stood perfectly still, waiting for my son to enter the room. The countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The music in the grand ballroom continued to play a soft classical melody. The wealthy guests continued to sip their expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that a line had just been crossed. I stood quietly near the heavy velvet curtains, my rough hand resting inside my coat pocket, my fingers tracing the jagged edges of the shattered silver watch. I did not feel humiliated anymore. I only felt a deep, cold anticipation. When you have lived as long as I have, you learn that revenge is not a loud explosion. It is a slow, methodical dismantling of your enemy's foundation. The heavy double doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was immediate. My son Julian walked into the room. Julian is not a man who enters a space quietly. He is 35 years old, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the country. My late wife Vivica and I raised him to be a predator in a world full of prey. We taught him how to read a room, how to spot a lie from a mile away, and how to strike only when the kill is absolutely guaranteed. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit. His posture was impeccable. As he stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers, his sharp eyes immediately began to scan the crowd. He did not look at the expensive flower arrangements. He did not look at the catered food. He was looking for me. His eyes swept across the marble floor. He noticed the small, barely visible scratch on the polished stone where Richard had ground his expensive leather shoe. He saw the tiny microscopic gears from my father's watch that I had not been able to pick up, catching the light like crushed diamonds. And then his gaze found me standing in the shadows. He saw my posture. He saw the tight line of my jaw. He saw my hand buried deep in my pocket. Julian knew me better than anyone alive. He instantly knew exactly what had just happened. Before he could take a step toward me, Chloe spotted him. She practically launched herself across the room. Her silk dress flowed behind her as she ran, wearing a perfectly practiced mask of sweet, innocent concern. She threw her arms around his neck, pressing herself against his chest, totally unaware of the cold, rigid tension radiating from his body. "Oh, Julian, darling, you are finally here," Chloe cooed loudly, making sure the surrounding guests could hear her performance. "We were so worried. Your father had a terrible little accident just a moment ago." Julian did not hug her back. He did not even look at her. His eyes were locked firmly on Richard, who was standing a few feet away, swirling a glass of red wine with a smug, victorious grin on his face. Chloe continued her pathetic script, totally oblivious to her husband's freezing demeanor. He is just so incredibly clumsy, she sighed, shaking her head in fake pity. He brought some old piece of junk, dropped it right on the floor, and almost ruined my father's brand new shoes. I told him he should go rest in the kitchen with the catering staff, but you know how stubborn he gets. Richard let out a loud, booming chuckle, stepping forward to join the conversation. He clapped a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, acting like the benevolent patriarch of the manor. "Do not be too hard on the old man," Julian, Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "He is getting up there in years. The hands get shaky, the mind gets a little foggy. I will have the maids sweep up the garbage he left on the floor. Come on, let me introduce you to the CEO of a real estate firm who wants to talk to you." Richard expected Julian to smile. He expected Julian to nod obediently and follow him like a well-trained dog. Richard firmly believed that because he was a wealthy white man who owned a manufacturing company, he was the ultimate authority in the room. He thought Julian was just a smart, lucky black kid who had been blessed to marry into his superior family. Julian slowly reached up and removed Richard's heavy hand from his shoulder. He did it with such a clinical, deliberate motion that it looked like he was removing a piece of dirty trash from his expensive suit. Julian then turned to Chloe. He gently took her arms from around his neck and pushed her away. He did not say a word to her. He simply walked past her, leaving her standing there with a confused, slightly panicked expression. Julian walked straight toward me. The crowd of wealthy guests naturally parted to let him through. He stopped in front of me. We did not need to exchange a long, emotional conversation. The bond between a father and a son who have survived the absolute bottom of society is telepathic. "Show me," Julian whispered, his voice dangerously low. I pulled my hand out of my coat pocket and opened the small wooden box. I showed him the crushed silver casing, the shattered glass, and the bent, ruined hands of his grandfather's antique watch. Julian's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked furiously in his cheek. He recognized the watch immediately. He knew the history behind it. He knew that my father had bought that watch with the very first paycheck he earned after working backbreaking labor in a steel mill. It was not just a piece of metal. It was the physical manifestation of our family's blood, sweat, and survival. And Richard had crushed it under his shoe for a cheap laugh. Julian took a slow, deep breath. He closed the wooden box and pushed my hand gently back toward my chest. He turned around to face the room. The music was still playing, but the immediate vicinity had grown incredibly quiet. The guests could sense the massive shift in the atmospheric pressure. Richard was still standing there, holding his wine glass, but his smug smile was beginning to falter. He shifted his weight uncomfortably under Julian's dead, unblinking stare. Julian began to walk slowly back toward Richard. Every step he took was measured, heavy, and terrifyingly calm. He stopped when he was exactly 2 feet away from his father-in-law. Richard tried to force a laugh, a nervous, rattling sound. "Come on now, Julian," Richard stammered, his false bravado crumbling. "It was just a piece of junk. I told you I will buy you a real gift tomorrow. Name your price." Julian did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He leaned in slightly, his eyes burning with an intense, calculated fury that only a top-tier corporate predator possesses. He looked directly into Richard's terrified face and delivered exactly 5 words. "You just bankrupted your family." He spoke the words so clearly, with such absolute, chilling certainty, that they seemed to echo off the high ceilings of the ballroom. The entire room went dead silent. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of wealthy chatter vanished completely. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 150 elite guests stood frozen in place, staring at the scene unfolding in the center of the grand foyer. Richard's face turned the color of wet cement. The wine glass in his hand trembled violently, spilling a few drops of red liquid onto his expensive shoes. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry gasping sound came out. "What are you talking about?" Richard finally choked out his voice, completely stripped of its arrogant power. Before Julian could answer, Chloe absolutely lost her mind. The perfectly constructed illusion of her superiority shattered into a million pieces. The reality of what she had just heard bypassed her logic and struck her directly in her massive, fragile ego. She stomped her high heel against the marble floor, her face turning a blotchy, furious red. "Are you completely insane?" Chloe screamed, her shrill voice shattering the heavy silence of the room. "How dare you speak to my father like that? He is a respected CEO. You are humiliating us in front of all of our important friends. Have you lost your mind?" Julian slowly turned his head to look at her. He looked at her not as a husband looks at a wife, but as a judge looks at a convicted criminal right before delivering the maximum sentence. Chloe did not understand the danger she was in. She was too accustomed to throwing tantrums and getting exactly what she wanted. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me. "This is all because of him," Chloe shrieked, tears of pure rage springing to her eyes. "This is because of your pathetic, useless old father. He comes in here dressed like a homeless person, ruins my perfect party, and now you are attacking my family to defend him. I will not tolerate this disrespect." She turned to the two large security guards standing near the front entrance of the ballroom. "Security," Chloe commanded, waving her arms frantically. "Grab this old piece of trash and throw him out of my house. I want him off my property right this second. Do you hear me? Get him out of my house." The guests gasped. Several women covered their mouths in shock. The security guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. They knew who Julian was, and they were not about to lay a hand on his father without his explicit permission. Chloe stood there, chest heaving, waiting for her orders to be obeyed. She firmly believed that her status as the wealthy white wife gave her supreme authority over the estate. She thought she was the queen of the castle, issuing an execution order against a worthless peasant. She had absolutely no idea that she had just marched herself directly onto the chopping block. Julian did not yell back at her. He simply reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. The real execution was about to begin. Chloe stood in the center of the grand marble floor, her chest heaving with absolute rage. She looked at the two large security guards who were still frozen by the heavy oak doors. "I pay your salaries," she screamed, pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest. "I said, get this old man off my property right now. This is my house. I will not have my perfect night ruined by some pathetic mechanic who does not even know how to dress himself." Julian watched her perform her little tantrum. He did not blink. He did not move to calm her down. He just let her dig her grave a little deeper. I stood quietly in the shadows watching my son operate. My late wife, Vivica, had taught him how to look right through a person's skin and see the rot inside their soul. Julian had seen the rot in Chloe a long time ago, and today was the day he finally decided to carve it out. "Are you deaf?" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing horribly off the crystal chandeliers. "My name is on the deed to this estate. I am the lady of this house. If you do not grab him by the collar and throw him out onto the street, I will fire both of you. I will make sure you never work in private security in this city again. Do your jobs." The security guards shifted uncomfortably, but they kept their eyes firmly on Julian. They knew exactly who signed their paychecks. They knew that the arrogant white woman screaming in the middle of the ballroom was nothing but a temporary guest in a fortress she did not own. Chloe turned to Julian, her face flushed with entitled fury. "Tell them, Julian. Tell them to throw your father out. This is our home. We built this life together. He is disrespecting my family and my own house in front of all of my important guests. You need to be a real man and protect your wife." Julian finally moved. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a phone to call the police. He pulled out a neatly folded stack of thick official legal documents. He unfolded the heavy parchment with deliberate, agonizing slowness. The crisp rustle of the paper seemed louder than the music that had just stopped playing. Julian looked at the paper, then looked at his wife. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any affection, cold enough to freeze the champagne in her glass. "You do not own a single brick of this house," Chloe, Julian said. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Chloe froze. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, nervous whispers. Richard and Beatrice, Chloe's parents, stepped forward from the crowd, their faces twisting into identical masks of arrogant outrage. "What are you talking about?" Chloe stammered, her fake confidence beginning to violently crack. "We signed the closing papers together 3 years ago. I saw my name on the mortgage documents. I decorated these halls. I picked out the imported Italian marble. This is my property." Julian shook his head slowly, a look of profound clinical pity crossing his face. "You saw exactly what I allowed you to see, Chloe. You signed a basic residential lease agreement that was disguised as a co-ownership application. You see, I am a senior corporate attorney. I deal with hostile takeovers and aggressive asset protection for a living. You honestly thought I would let a woman who secretly funnels my money to her bankrupt parents put her name on a $10 million piece of real estate?" Julian held up the documents for her to see. The bold black letters at the top of the page were unmistakable. This entire estate is owned completely and exclusively by the Rollins Family Trust, Julian explained, his voice echoing in the silent, suffocating room. My father, the man you just insulted, the man your father just assaulted, is the sole primary executor of that trust. He bought this land. He funded the construction with his own money. You and I have simply been living here under a conditional use clause, and that specific clause had a very firm expiration date. Chloe looked like she had just been violently struck across the face. She stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the hem of her expensive silk dress. She bumped into a tall cocktail table, sending a few glasses crashing to the floor. Her mother, Beatrice, rushed forward to catch her by the arm, her eyes wide with absolute horror. The expiration date of the lease, Julian continued, relentlessly ignoring the shattered glass, was set for the exact day I turned 35, which happens to be today. At midnight tonight, your legal right to occupy this property officially and permanently terminates. And since you just decided to publicly humiliate the man who actually owns the roof over your head, I am accelerating the timeline. Julian checked his expensive watch, tapping the glass face with his index finger. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your designer clothes, gather your expensive shoes, and get off my father's property. If you are still inside these walls in 61 minutes, I will have those security guards drag you out by your hair for criminal trespassing. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was audible. The wealthy socialites who had been laughing at me just minutes ago were now staring at Julian in absolute terror. They were witnessing a brutal, calculated execution. Chloe began to hyperventilate. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face as she sobbed openly. She looked around the grand ballroom, realizing that the kingdom she had been ruling with an iron fist was nothing but a magnificent mirage. She had been playing house in a fortress built by the very black man she despised. You cannot do this, Chloe wailed, clinging tightly to her mother's arm. We are married. I am your wife. Half of everything you have is mine. The law protects me. You cannot throw me out into the street like a common criminal. Julian offered a cold, humorless smile. We will discuss the ironclad prenuptial agreement you signed without reading when we see each other in court. But tonight you are nothing but a trespasser in a house you do not own. That was when Richard finally stepped in. The humiliation of seeing his daughter stripped of her fake royalty, crying in front of his wealthy peers, was too much for his massive, fragile ego to handle. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face turning a violent, explosive shade of purple. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size and his status as a wealthy white business owner to intimidate my son. Listen to me, you arrogant little punk, Richard barked, pointing a thick, shaking finger right at Julian's face. You think you can treat my daughter like this? You think you can play dirty legal games with my family? You have absolutely no idea who you are messing with. Beatrice, standing next to him, chimed in with her shrill, venomous voice. We welcomed you into our elite circle, Julian. We let you sit at our dinner table. We introduced you to the right people. And this is how you repay us, by choosing this old, pathetic mechanic over your own beautiful wife. Julian did not flinch. He stood his ground, staring down the angry manufacturing boss without a single ounce of fear. Richard took another heavy step forward, his voice dropping to a menacing, guttural growl. I run a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire, Richard threatened, his spit flying through the air. I play golf with the federal judges in this city. I sit on the board of directors for the biggest corporate firms in the state. I will make 3 phone calls tomorrow morning, and your career as a hotshot lawyer will be completely over. You will be disbarred. You will be financially ruined. I will crush you, Julian, and I will crush this pathetic old man standing behind you. I will make sure both of you end up back in the ghetto where you belong. The threat hung heavy in the air. Richard thought his money and his connections made him an untouchable god. He thought he could snap his fingers and destroy 2 generations of black men just because his pride was hurt. He was entirely confident that his million-dollar manufacturing company gave him the ultimate leverage. He did not know that his precious manufacturing company was entirely dependent on a piece of technology that I had invented 30 years ago. He did not know that the old black man he was threatening to crush was the exact same man who held the patents to his entire livelihood. He had just handed me the perfect opening, and it was finally time for me to step out of the shadows and show him who the real king was. Richard stood in the center of the grand ballroom, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a toxic, entitled rage. He was a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He firmly believed that his wealth, his country club memberships, and his white skin gave him the absolute authority to crush anyone who dared to stand in his way. He looked at my son Julian and unleashed a torrent of threats designed to completely destroy a man's livelihood. "I will make 3 phone calls tomorrow morning," Richard roared, spit flying from his lips. "I play golf with the senior partners of your law firm. I have federal judges on my speed dial. You think you are smart, Julian, but you are nothing but an arrogant kid who got lucky. By noon tomorrow, you will be stripped of your partnership. By Friday, you will be disbarred. I will personally see to it that you never practice corporate law in this country ever again." Beatrice stood right beside her husband, her face twisted into an ugly, vindictive sneer. "We gave you everything," Julian Beatrice hissed. "We elevated you. We brought you into a world you never could have entered on your own. And you throw it all away for this pathetic, dirty old man." She pointed a diamond-ringed finger directly at me. Richard turned his furious gaze in my direction. He looked me up and down with absolute, unadulterated disgust. He saw a simple corduroy jacket and calloused hands, and his arrogant mind immediately classified me as a worthless target. "And as for you," Richard spat, taking a heavy step toward me, "you are going to die in the exact same gutter you came from. You think you can walk into my daughter's party, drop your garbage on the floor, and let your son disrespect my family? I am going to bury you both. I am going to tie you up in so much litigation that you will spend the last few miserable years of your life sleeping on a park bench." Julian did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to defend himself. He simply looked at me, a brief silent exchange passing between us. He had played his part perfectly. He had stripped Chloe of her fake castle and exposed her greed. Now it was my turn to dismantle the king. I finally stepped out of the shadows. I did not walk with a cane. I did not shuffle like a broken, tired old man. I walked with the heavy, undeniable presence of a man who has survived the absolute worst this world has to offer and emerged as an apex predator. The crowd of wealthy elites parted for me instinctively. They could feel the sudden massive shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I stopped right in front of Richard. I am a few inches taller than him, and I looked down into his red, sweating face. I did not yell. I did not curse. My voice was incredibly low, gravelly, and terrifyingly calm. It cut through the heavy silence of the ballroom like a serrated blade. "Richard," I said softly, "you own a mid-sized industrial manufacturing firm on the south side of the city. You specialize in high-pressure automotive and aerospace components, is that correct?" Richard blinked, entirely caught off guard by the question. He expected me to beg. He expected me to cower in fear of his powerful connections and his legal threats. He did not expect me to casually bring up his business portfolio in the middle of a screaming match. "What does my company have to do with you, you old fool?" Richard sneered, trying desperately to recover his aggressive momentum. "I own one of the most profitable manufacturing plants in the state. I hold contracts with the federal government. I am untouchable." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked dead on his. "You run a massive assembly line," I continued, completely ignoring his insults. "Your entire production facility relies on heavy-duty hydraulic presses. Tell me, Richard, does your primary production line still utilize the specific hydraulic bypass valve system coded as the 774B model?" The angry, arrogant flush on Richard's face completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a look of profound, staggering confusion. His brow furrowed. He stared at me, trying to process how a man he viewed as a worthless mechanic knew the exact, highly classified alphanumeric operational code of his most critical factory machinery. "How do you know about the 774B valve?" Richard demanded, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority. "That is proprietary operational data. You have no business knowing anything about the internal mechanics of my assembly line." I reached into the pocket of my simple corduroy jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out my cell phone. "I know about it, Richard," I explained, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. "Because in 1982, while wealthy men like you were sitting in air-conditioned offices drinking expensive scotch, I was crawling underneath those exact same industrial presses. I was covered in oil, working double shifts in a sweltering factory where they paid me a fraction of what I was worth. I noticed a critical flaw in the fluid dynamics of the standard hydraulic systems. They were overheating and causing massive production delays. So I went home to my tiny freezing garage and I engineered a permanent solution. I unlocked my phone and opened a highly secured executive application. I invented the 774B bypass valve I stated clearly. I patented the design. I hold the exclusive intellectual property rights. Every single hydraulic press in your multi-million-dollar factory requires my specific valve to function safely. Without it, your entire assembly line locks up, your machines overheat, and your entire production grinds to an absolute catastrophic halt. Richard's jaw dropped. His eyes widened in sheer unadulterated terror. He took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes. "That is impossible," Richard stammered, shaking his head frantically, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. "That is a complete lie. I leased that technology from a massive multi-billion-dollar global holding firm. I have an ironclad contract with Apex Industrial Solutions." I offered him a cold, empty smile. "Apex Industrial Solutions is a subsidiary shell company, Richard. And I am the majority shareholder and the sole chairman of the board. You have been paying me a licensing fee every single month for the last 20 years. Your entire empire is built entirely on the back of my intellectual property." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of elite guests. Chloe looked back and forth between her father and me, her face pale, completely unable to comprehend that the man she had just banished to the kitchen was the architect of her family's entire fortune. Beatrice clutched her chest, suddenly struggling to breathe as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. "You are bluffing." Richard choked out, sweat pouring down his forehead. "You cannot touch my company. We have a signed licensing agreement. It is legally binding. You cannot just terminate it because your feelings are hurt." I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up his specific corporate file. "If you had ever bothered to read the fine print of your operational contracts, Richard, you would know that there is a standard morality and breach of conduct clause built into every single licensing agreement my company issues," I explained. "It gives the patent holder the unilateral, uncontestable right to revoke the licensing privileges immediately if the licensee engages in behavior that is deemed maliciously hostile toward the holding entity or its primary shareholders." I looked down at the shattered pieces of my father's silver watch still resting quietly inside the wooden box in my pocket. "You did not just insult me tonight, Richard. You deliberately destroyed a priceless piece of my family history, and you threatened to illegally destroy my son's legal career. That is the very definition of malicious hostility." I looked him dead in the eyes. I raised my thumb and hovered it right over the red termination button on my screen. "You thought you could crush me, Richard," I whispered. "But you forgot the most important rule of the factory floor. You never disrespect the man who holds the keys to the machine." I pressed the button. A green confirmation banner flashed across my screen. "The digital revocation order has just been transmitted to your factory floor management system," I announced, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "In exactly 60 seconds, your automated production line is going to shut down completely. Your government contracts will be breached by tomorrow morning. To retrofit your entire factory with a different valve system will cost you tens of millions of dollars and take at least 6 months. You just bankrupted your family," Julian had told him. And now Richard finally understood exactly what those 5 words meant. Right on cue, the absolute silence of the ballroom was shattered by the shrill, panicked ringing of Richard's cell phone. He reached into his pocket with trembling, uncoordinated hands. He pulled the phone out and stared at the screen. The caller ID glowed brightly. It was his night shift plant manager. Richard answered the phone, bringing it slowly to his ear. His hand was shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device. "Sir," a tiny, panicked voice could be heard leaking from the speaker. "The entire hydraulic grid just initiated an emergency lockdown. The system is showing a hard licensing revocation. Everything is stopped. We are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars by the minute. What do we do?" Richard did not answer his manager. The phone slipped from his weak, sweating fingers and clattered onto the hard marble floor. The arrogant, untouchable manufacturing king completely collapsed in on himself. He fell to his knees in the middle of the extravagant party right next to the tiny scratch his shoe had left on the floor. His multi-million-dollar empire had just been entirely eradicated by a 72-year-old black man with a single click of a button. The heavy thud of Richard's phone hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. The arrogant manufacturing king was on his knees, his breath coming in short, panicked wheezes. The reality of his absolute destruction was suffocating him. But while Richard was breaking down under the weight of his ruined empire, his daughter was completely fracturing from reality. Chloe could not process what she was seeing. Her brain, conditioned by a lifetime of extreme privilege and zero accountability, simply rejected the facts standing right in front of her. She could not accept that the elderly black man she had just banished to the kitchen was actually the architect of her family's entire fortune. She could not accept that her castle was built on my land. So she did what manipulative people always do when the truth corners them. She violently twisted the narrative and played the victim. She spun around and launched herself at my son. She grabbed the lapels of Julian's expensive suit, her eyes wide, wild, and brimming with hysterical tears. "Julian, please," Chloe begged, her voice trembling with a sickeningly sweet, desperate pitch. "You have to stop him. He has completely lost his mind. I do not know what kind of legal tricks he is playing or what he is threatening you with, but you cannot let him do this to us. He is trying to destroy our marriage. He is jealous of us, Julian. He is forcing you into this." She pressed her face against his chest, sobbing loudly, putting on a theatrical performance for the wealthy guests who were still staring in absolute shock. "Tell him to leave, Julian." Chloe wept, her manicured fingers digging into his jacket. "Tell him to get out and fix whatever computer virus he just sent to my father's company. We are a team, Julian. We love each other. You need to protect your wife from this crazy old man." I stood a few feet away, watching her frantic, pathetic display. She honestly thought Julian was just a passive pawn. She believed she could use her tears and her status as his white wife to completely overwrite the undeniable facts I had just laid out. She thought she could manipulate him into turning against his own blood. Julian did not wrap his arms around her. He did not whisper comforting words into her ear. He stood as rigid and cold as a statue carved from solid ice. He slowly reached up, grabbed her wrists, and forcefully peeled her hands off his suit. He pushed her back, creating a wide physical distance between them. The absolute disgust on his face was unmistakable. "Do not ever touch me again," Julian said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying surgical precision. It was the voice of a seasoned corporate prosecutor about to dismantle a hostile witness on the stand. Chloe stumbled back, her tears pausing in pure shock. "Julian, what are you saying?" she whimpered, her lower lip trembling. "I am your wife. He is manipulating you." "My father is not manipulating me, Chloe," Julian replied, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. "My father and I have been working together in absolute silence for the last 6 months. We have been waiting for this exact night." The confusion on Chloe's face deepened, mixing with a sudden creeping terror. 6 months, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Julian took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "You think you are the only one in this house who knows how to keep a secret?" he asked, his tone dripping with venom. "You thought you married a fool. You thought because I worked 80 hours a week at the law firm I was too busy to notice what was happening inside my own bank accounts." Chloe flinched. The color rapidly drained from her face. She took another step back, her high heel wobbling on the marble floor. "I am a senior partner in corporate litigation, Chloe." Julian continued relentlessly. "I track hidden assets and offshore shell companies for a living. Did you honestly believe I would not notice when $500,000 began quietly bleeding out of my personal investment portfolios?" A loud gasp rippled through the crowd of elite guests. Beatrice, Chloe's mother, covered her mouth with trembling hands. Richard, still kneeling on the floor, slowly looked up, his eyes wide with a new, horrifying realization. "I do not know what you are talking about," Chloe stammered, her voice cracking. Her fake tears were gone, completely replaced by the raw, suffocating panic of a cornered thief. "Do not lie to me!" Julian barked, his voice finally rising, cracking like a whip across the room. "I know everything!" 6 months ago, I noticed a series of bizarre withdrawals disguised as payments to high-end interior design firms and private contractors for this estate. I pulled the routing numbers. I traced the wire transfers. They did not go to any designers, Chloe. They went directly into the primary operating accounts of your father's manufacturing company. Julian pointed a sharp, accusing finger down at Richard, who flinched as if he had been physically struck. "Your father's company has been bleeding cash for 2 years," Julian exposed, broadcasting their dirty, pathetic secret to every wealthy socialite in the room. He made terrible investments. He lost major distribution contracts. He was drowning in debt and facing absolute bankruptcy. And instead of acting like a man and restructuring his business, he came crying to his daughter. And you decided to play the loyal savior by actively embezzling money from your own husband to keep his sinking ship afloat. Chloe was hyperventilating now. She shook her head frantically, looking around at her elite friends, hoping anyone would step in to save her. But the wealthy guests were looking at her with absolute revulsion. In their world, losing money is a tragedy, but stealing money from your spouse to cover up a bankruptcy is an unforgivable, trashy sin. Her social status was evaporating right in front of her eyes. I was going to pay it back. Chloe choked out, accidentally validating every single word Julian had just said. I was going to put it back as soon as my dad secured his new government contract. We are family, Julian. We are supposed to help each other. You did not ask for help, Julian replied, his voice freezing over again. You stole from me. You forged my signature on internal bank authorizations. You smiled in my face, kissed me goodnight, and then funneled my hard-earned money to your arrogant racist father who has never shown me an ounce of respect. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up for her to see. When I found the first fraudulent transfer 6 months ago, I did not confront you, Julian explained, revealing the absolute terrifying depth of his patience. I knew if I confronted you immediately, you would cry, you would play the victim, and your father would find a way to hide the rest of the paper trail. So I went to my father. Julian looked at me. I gave him a slow, firm nod. My father and I sat in his workshop. Julian continued, and we built a trap. I let you keep stealing. I let you think you were a criminal mastermind. I documented every single wire transfer. I gathered every forged signature. I built an airtight, undeniable federal fraud case against you and your parents. And my father prepared the ultimate kill switch for your father's supply chain. Chloe was shaking so violently she looked like she might collapse. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at her husband as if she were looking at a stranger. She had grossly underestimated the man she married. She thought his love made him blind and weak. She did not realize his love was conditional on her loyalty, and once she broke that, he became a predator. You wanted to throw this massive, extravagant birthday party to show off to your elite friends, Julian said, gesturing around the grand ballroom. You wanted to play the perfect wealthy hostess. I let you plan every single detail. I let you invite every single important person you know. I wanted them all here, because I did not just want to divorce you, Chloe. I wanted to gather every single one of your enablers in one room, lock the doors, and force them to watch while my father and I burned your entire fake empire to the absolute ground. Julian stepped back, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket with a chilling, businesslike precision. The trap just snapped shut, Julian announced. Your father's company is dead, your reputation is completely destroyed, and the fraud dossier is already sitting on the desk of the district attorney. You played a very stupid game with the wrong family, Chloe. And you just lost everything. The grand ballroom cleared out faster than a burning building. Wealthy socialites and corporate elites do not stick around when the heavy stench of bankruptcy and federal fraud fills the air. They are creatures of self-preservation. They scurried toward the cloakroom, clutching their expensive coats and keeping their heads down, completely avoiding eye contact with Richard and Beatrice. In less than 10 minutes, the lavish birthday party that Chloe had meticulously orchestrated to show off her superior status was entirely empty. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and fled. The catering staff vanished into the kitchen. Chloe was left standing in the center of the massive empty room. Her perfect silk dress looked ridiculous now. She was shivering, completely consumed by a toxic mixture of absolute rage and profound humiliation. Richard finally found his voice. It was raspy, weak, and completely devoid of the booming authoritative power he had paraded around with just half an hour ago. But a narcissist never truly surrenders. They just look for someone else to blame. Richard pointed a trembling, sweaty finger at my son. "You think you have won?" Richard snarled, trying to piece together his shattered pride. "You think you can ambush us with a few financial tricks and throw my daughter out on the street? I am going to hire the most vicious, ruthless divorce attorneys in this entire country. We are going to take half of everything you own, Julian. We are going to drag you through a legal bloodbath. By the time we are finished, you and your pathetic father will have absolutely nothing left." I watched Julian smile. It was a cold, empty smile that did not reach his eyes. He stood with his hands casually resting in his pockets, completely unbothered by the empty threats of a defeated man. "You have exactly 45 minutes left to vacate my father's property," Julian said smoothly. "I highly suggest you spend less time making ridiculous threats and more time packing your bags. If you are still standing on this marble floor when the clock runs out, the security team is going to drag you down the driveway by your expensive collars." Beatrice grabbed her husband's arm, pulling him toward the grand sweeping staircase. Chloe followed them frantically, lifting the hem of her dress as she ran up the stairs to the master suite. For the next 40 minutes, the silent house was filled with the frantic sounds of doors slamming, drawers being yanked open, and heavy footsteps rushing across the hardwood floors. Chloe was desperately stuffing designer dresses, expensive handbags, and diamond jewelry into her luxury suitcases. She was trying to salvage whatever physical wealth she could carry, completely unaware that half of those items were purchased with stolen money that she would soon have to answer for in a federal court. When they finally came back down to the foyer, Chloe was dragging 3 massive heavy suitcases behind her. Richard and Beatrice each carried 2 more. They looked like refugees fleeing a fallen kingdom. Not a single member of the household staff stepped forward to help them carry their bags. The maids and the security guards simply stood in the shadows, watching the arrogant family struggle under the weight of their own vanity. They walked out through the heavy oak doors, the exact same doors Chloe had tried to banish me from just an hour earlier. They marched out into the cool night air, their pride utterly crushed, completely stripped of their power and their fake royalty. Julian and I did not watch them drive away. We walked into his private study, a quiet room lined with dark wood and heavy books. Julian walked over to a crystal decanter and poured 2 generous glasses of aged bourbon. He handed one to me. We clinked our glasses together in the quiet room. We toasted to my father, whose broken silver watch now rested safely on the center of the mahogany desk. The silence in the house was absolutely beautiful. We took our seats and waited. We knew exactly what was happening at that very moment. Chloe and her parents were driving into the heart of the city in Richard's luxury car, fuming with anger, plotting their grand imaginary revenge. When people like them experience a massive traumatic defeat, their immediate instinct is to surround themselves with extreme luxury to soothe their bruised egos. They needed to feel rich again. They needed a place to sit, order expensive room service, and convince themselves that they were still the masters of the universe. I knew they were heading straight for the most expensive, exclusive 5-star hotel in the downtown district. My prediction was off by exactly 12 minutes. Julian's cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of the desk. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim room. It was Chloe. Julian looked at me across the desk. I gave him a slow, firm nod. He reached out, pressed the green button to accept the call, and put the phone on speaker mode. He did not say a word. He just let the audio fill the room. Julian Chloe's voice exploded through the tiny speaker. She was absolutely hysterical. Her shrill voice was echoing off what sounded like a large, cavernous lobby. "Stop playing these psychotic, childish games right now," she screamed, completely abandoning any pretense of composure. "I am standing at the front desk of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The concierge just declined my primary platinum card. He said it was rejected by the issuer. I gave him my secondary gold card and the machine literally confiscated it. It swallowed the card, Julian." I could hear the absolute suffocating panic radiating through her voice. The concierge was likely staring at her with that specific polite pity that luxury hotel employees reserve for people whose wealth has suddenly evaporated. The embarrassment of having a credit card declined in a 5-star lobby is a fate worse than death for a woman whose entire identity is built on unlimited spending power. "I tried all 4 of my luxury cards," Chloe continued to wail, her breath hitching with genuine terror. "Every single one is locked. You froze my accounts. You are maliciously restricting my access to marital funds. My parents are standing right here watching this happen. You are humiliating me in public. You need to call the bank and authorize these charges right this second, or I swear I will add financial abuse to the lawsuit my father is filing tomorrow." Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. He swallowed, letting the warm liquid settle, and leaned forward toward the phone. "You are a profoundly stupid woman," Chloe Julian said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any sympathy, echoing with the icy precision of a corporate executioner. "Excuse me," Chloe gasped, deeply offended that he was not instantly bowing to her demands. "You claim to be so sophisticated," Julian continued calmly. You brag about your elite status and your vast understanding of wealth. Yet in 3 years of marriage, you never once bothered to look at the actual billing statements for those shiny platinum cards you love to swipe so much. What are you talking about? She demanded, though her voice was starting to waver. I know my accounts. I know what my limits are. Unfreeze them right now. They are not your accounts, Julian explained, slowly, speaking to her as if she were a very slow, very stubborn child. Those cards are not tied to my personal checking account. They are not marital assets. They are not joint credit lines. They are supplementary corporate expense accounts. They are entirely underwritten, funded, and legally guaranteed by a private logistics firm. Julian paused, letting the silence stretch for a brief, agonizing moment. They are guaranteed by S.J. Holdings, Julian stated. My father's company, the exact same company your father is currently trying to figure out how to survive without. I could hear a sharp, sudden intake of breath from the other end of the line. The terrifying reality was finally crashing down on her. The money she used to buy her designer dresses, the money she used to pay for her lavish lunches, the money she thought proved she was better than the old black man she banished to the kitchen. It all belonged to me. Every single penny of her fake luxury lifestyle was funded by my sweat. Julian delivered the final devastating blow. I did not freeze your cards, Chloe, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dark, unforgiving whisper. My father did. And he did not do it just now. He locked those accounts the exact second your arrogant father brought his heel down on my grandfather's antique watch. You have $0. You have zero credit. You have absolutely zero leverage. There was no screaming on the other end of the line. There were no more threats about vicious lawyers or massive lawsuits. There was only a dead, hollow silence followed by the sound of Chloe's frantic, terrified breathing. She was standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel she could not afford, surrounded by parents who were just as broke as she was, realizing that she had absolutely nothing left to her name. Julian reached out and pressed the red button, cutting the connection completely. The room returned to its peaceful, beautiful silence. He picked up his glass of bourbon and raised it toward me. I raised my glass in return. The shark had just realized it had no teeth, and the water was rapidly draining from the tank. The morning after a massacre is always the most revealing. When you completely destroy a person's entire false reality, they do not wake up with a sudden sense of humility. They do not look in the mirror and decide to become better people. They wake up desperate, angry, and looking for a bigger weapon. I was sitting across from my son Julian at his heavy mahogany dining table. We were drinking black coffee and reviewing the digital fallout from the night before. Richard's manufacturing company was currently hemorrhaging money by the second. The hydraulic presses were completely locked out. The night shift had been sent home. The morning shift was standing around in absolute confusion. Julian knew his wife better than anyone in the world. He looked at me over his coffee cup and told me that Chloe and her father were going to run to the biggest legal shark in the city. He said they honestly believed that a piece of paper and a loud white lawyer would somehow erase the fact that she stole from him and her father relied entirely on my patents. I nodded slowly. I told Julian to let the shark swim to us. We did not have to wait very long at all. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, Julian's private cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed the name Vance and Sterling Legal Group. Julian let out a dry, humorless laugh. He told me that Vance and Sterling was the most notorious cutthroat divorce firm in the entire state. They specialized in representing wealthy, entitled white women who wanted to completely strip their husbands of every single asset they owned. They were famous for aggressive litigation, freezing bank accounts, and dragging out divorces until the husband simply surrendered out of sheer financial exhaustion. Julian reached for the phone, but I placed my heavy hand over his. I told him to put this device on the table and turn on the speakerphone. I wanted to handle this specific piece of garbage myself. Julian smiled, tapped the green button, and leaned back in his chair. Julian, a loud, incredibly arrogant voice boomed through the small speaker. This is Arthur Vance, senior partner at Vance and Sterling. I am sitting here in my office with your wife Chloe and your father-in-law Richard. I am calling to inform you that we are filing a massive comprehensive divorce petition this morning. We are seeking immediate emergency spousal support, full access to all joint investment accounts, and a complete restraining order regarding the property you illegally evicted her from last night. Vance did not pause to let Julian speak. He was using the classic bully tactic. Talk fast, talk loud, and overwhelm the target. He wanted to establish absolute dominance right from the start. Listen to me very carefully, boy, Vance continued, his tone dripping with racial and class superiority. You made a very serious mistake last night. You embarrassed a highly respected family. Richard has authorized me to spare absolutely no expense in completely destroying your life. We are going to freeze your law firm partnerships. We are going to audit every single penny you have ever earned. You think you are a smart lawyer, but you are completely out of your league. We want a settlement of $10 million by the end of the week, or we will bury you so deep you will not see daylight again. I let him finish his little speech. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. People who talk too much are always terrified of silence. I leaned forward, bringing my face close to the microphone on the phone. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice deep gravelly and completely calm. Julian is not going to be speaking with you today. You are speaking with Nathaniel Rollins. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. I could hear papers shuffling. Vance let out a condescending sigh. The father Vance said dismissively, the mechanic. Listen, old man, I do not have time to talk to the hired help. Put your son back on the phone before I add elder abuse to the list of charges we are bringing against him. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him. I simply asked a question. Mr. Vance, what is the exact physical address of your prestigious law firm? Vance scoffed loudly. Are you completely incompetent? We are located at 400 West Madison Street, Suite 5500. The premium executive floors. Not that you would ever be allowed past the lobby security. Now put Julian on the line. 400 West Madison Street. I repeated slowly, letting every syllable land with heavy precision. Yes, I know the building very well, Mr. Vance. It has beautiful glass elevators and a very impressive marble atrium. I know it well because my private holding company, Rollins Trust and Equities, wired $65 million to purchase that entire commercial property at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. The line went completely, absolutely dead silent. I could practically hear the oxygen leaving the room miles away in downtown Chicago. The arrogance evaporated into thin air. You see, Mr. Vance, I continued smoothly, I am a man who likes to be prepared. I had my team audit the tenant rent rolls of my new building before the purchase officially cleared. I noticed that Vance and Sterling Legal Group recently let their long-term commercial lease expire. You are currently operating on a month-to-month holdover agreement while you try to negotiate a lower rate. Is that correct? Vance did not say a word. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing through the speaker. He was a shark who had just realized he was swimming in a tank owned by a much bigger, much hungrier predator. He realized he was talking to a ghost, a black man he had dismissed as a peasant, who suddenly held the keys to his entire corporate existence. As the sole owner of the building, I stated coldly, I have the unilateral legal authority to adjust the terms of any month-to-month holdover tenancy. Effective immediately, your monthly office rent is tripled. Furthermore, if you file a single piece of paper on behalf of Chloe or Richard, if you even draft an email with my son's name on it, I will issue an immediate 30-day notice to vacate. I will legally evict your entire firm. I will throw your mahogany desks, your fancy leather chairs, and your arrogant self out onto the sidewalk. And because I hold immense influence in the commercial real estate sector of this city, I will personally guarantee that no other premium building will ever lease office space to you again. The silence on the phone was absolute. The booming voice of the powerful white lawyer had completely vanished. He had been reduced to a terrified, speechless coward in less than 2 minutes. When you strip away a man's artificial leverage, you find out very quickly exactly what he is made of. Vance was made of nothing but cheap suits and empty threats. So, Mr. Vance, I asked quietly, are we going to court? Mr. Rollins. Vance choked out, his voice cracking and high-pitched. There has been a massive misunderstanding. I sincerely apologize. We have no interest in pursuing this case. We are dropping them as clients immediately. Before I could even respond, I heard a chaotic eruption of noise in the background of the call. I heard Richard screaming in shock. I heard Chloe wailing. I heard Vance barking orders at them. Get out of my office, Vance roared at them, completely abandoning his professional demeanor. Get out right now. You told me you were dealing with a low-level corporate lawyer and a broke mechanic. You lied to me. You are a massive liability. Security, get these people out of my suite immediately. The call abruptly disconnected. The dial tone buzzed loudly in the quiet dining room. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee. Julian looked at me, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. He shook his head in absolute awe. The shark had just had every single one of its teeth violently pulled out without anesthesia. Chloe and Richard had walked into that office building thinking their white privilege and their fake money would buy them an army to destroy us. They expected the system to protect them like it always had. Instead, they were being physically escorted out of the lobby by security guards, humiliated and discarded by the very lawyer they hired to save them. They were completely toxic. They were legally radioactive. No reputable lawyer in the city would touch them now, and they were completely out of options. The walls were closing in fast, and I was holding the only key to the door. When you cut the head off a poisonous snake, the body does not stop moving right away. It thrashes in the dirt. It snaps its jaws at the empty air. It bleeds out slowly, destroying everything in its immediate path before it finally goes entirely still. Richard was currently thrashing in the dirt. The digital kill switch I activated had completely paralyzed his entire manufacturing empire. I did not need to be standing inside his massive industrial plant to know exactly what was happening on the factory floor. The heavy steel hydraulic presses were completely dead. The conveyor belts were frozen in place. Hundreds of confused factory workers were standing around in the sweltering heat looking up at the glass windows of the executive offices waiting for answers that their arrogant boss could not possibly give them. In the high-stakes world of industrial manufacturing, time is not just money. Time is absolute survival. The massive aerospace companies and government defense contractors that relied on Richard's supply chain do not care about family drama. They do not care that a wealthy white man had his fragile ego bruised at a birthday party. They operate on strict, unforgiving deadlines and massive profit margins. When Richard's delivery trucks did not roll out of the loading bays on Monday morning, the corporate predators immediately began to circle the bleeding carcass of his company. By Wednesday afternoon, my internal financial contacts informed me that the bloodbath had officially begun. 3 of Richard's biggest clients had formally filed massive breach of contract lawsuits against his firm. They were demanding tens of millions of dollars in immediate financial damages for the stalled production lines. They were pulling their future orders. They were publicly severing all ties. Richard's entire corporate reputation was disintegrating right in front of his eyes. He was completely cornered. His prestigious law firm had kicked him and his daughter out onto the curb. Traditional banks had taken one look at his frozen assembly line, the mounting lawsuits, and his toxic public profile, and they immediately denied him any emergency lines of credit. A normal man would have looked at the wreckage, admitted defeat, declared bankruptcy, and tried to salvage whatever scraps of dignity he had left. But Richard was not a normal man. He was a man deeply infected with the terminal disease of white privilege and unearned entitlement. He firmly believed he was meant to rule the world, and he was completely willing to step on the necks of innocent people to keep his paper crown from falling. When the bright, secure doors of legitimate banking are slammed shut, desperate men are forced to crawl into the dark. Richard needed a massive influx of cash immediately to pay off his furious corporate clients and keep the lights on in his dead factory. So he turned his attention to the shadow lenders. He went looking for the predatory high-interest loan syndicates operating on the fringes of the financial sector. These are the kind of ruthless lenders who do not ask for legitimate collateral or solid business plans. They charge 40% interest, they hide their money offshore, and they deal in highly unethical collection methods. But even a predatory loan shark requires a verified identity and a somewhat clean credit profile to issue a multi-million-dollar cash injection. Richard's personal credit was deeply entangled with his failing company. His financial profile was currently hemorrhaging value by the second. He could not use his own name on the applications. He could not use his wife Beatrice, and he certainly could not use his disgraced daughter Chloe. They were all financially radioactive. So Richard did something so profoundly evil, so utterly devoid of a basic moral compass, that it almost surprised me. Almost. He turned his predatory sights on the very people he had exploited his entire career. He accessed the highly confidential human resources database of his own manufacturing company. He pulled the personal employee files of his blue-collar factory workers, the mechanics, the floor managers, the janitors, the men and women who clocked in every single day sweating on his assembly line to build his massive wealth. people who lived paycheck to paycheck just trying to feed their children. He stole their social security numbers. He stole their home addresses, their dates of birth, and their clean working-class credit histories. Sitting alone in his dark, silent executive office, Richard systematically forged dozens of shadow loan applications. He used his own employees' stolen identities as phantom guarantors to secure a massive commercial loan from an offshore lending syndicate. He was perfectly willing to completely destroy the financial futures of his own innocent workers just to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. He was shifting his massive debt onto the shoulders of the working class. He thought he was a genius. He thought he had outsmarted the banking system and found a brilliant, untraceable loophole. He completely forgot that the man who built the bypass valves running his factory was also a man who understood the digital financial architecture of the entire city. I am not a man who waits for things to happen. I dictate exactly when and how they happen. The moment I shut down his factory with my phone, I had my wealth management team install aggressive, highly sensitive digital tripwires around every single financial entity connected to Richard's manufacturing firm. I placed high-level security alerts on the regional credit bureaus. I had my cybersecurity team monitoring the dark web financial registries for any sudden movements related to his corporate internet protocol address. It was late Thursday night. I was sitting in my comfortable leather armchair in my quiet living room listening to a vinyl record of old blues music. I was playing a solitary game of chess, studying the board with quiet focus. My son Julian was sitting across the room on the sofa reviewing some heavy legal case files for his own firm. The peaceful golden silence of my home was suddenly interrupted by a sharp repeating chime from my secure laptop resting on the side table. I slowly stood up, smoothed the fabric of my trousers, walked over to the desk, and opened the monitoring dashboard. The screen was flashing with a rapid cascade of high-priority red alerts. Julian set his thick stack of papers down on the coffee table and walked over to stand right behind my shoulder. He leaned in and looked at the scrolling green and red data on the bright screen. His dark eyes immediately narrowed. "What exactly am I looking at right now?" Julian asked, his voice low, steady, and deadly serious. "You are looking at a desperate, foolish man grabbing a shovel and digging his own grave 10 feet deeper," I replied smoothly. I pointed my finger to the digital transaction logs pouring onto the screen. The tripwires my team had set up successfully intercepted the metadata from the offshore lending syndicate. I watched in cold silence as the names of Richard's factory workers flashed across my monitor one by one. I recognized some of those names. They were good, hardworking people. Their names were being illegally attached to shadow loan requests for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The monitoring system successfully traced the origin of the fraudulent applications directly back to the static internet protocol address of Richard's executive office. "He is committing mass identity theft," Julian stated, a look of pure clinical disgust washing over his face. "He is literally stealing the credit profiles of his own employees to secure shadow loans to save his bankrupt company. This is not just a standard white-collar violation. This is a severe federal felony. The Department of Justice will absolutely bury him under a federal prison for this." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the scrolling numbers. I felt a cold, hard anger settling deep into my chest. Richard had spent his entire arrogant life looking down on working-class people. He had looked at me in my simple corduroy jacket at that birthday party and treated me like absolute trash. Now he was literally stealing the identities of hardworking men and women to save his own miserable skin. He was willing to let innocent families face absolute financial ruin just so he could pretend he was still a successful, wealthy chief executive. I did not immediately pick up the phone to call the authorities. A novice fighter strikes the moment he sees an opening. A grandmaster waits until the opponent has completely committed to the fatal move. You never interrupt your enemy when he is making a catastrophic mistake. I picked up my cell phone and called my lead cybersecurity expert. I instructed him to carefully and quietly clone all the incoming data. We captured the forged electronic signatures. We secured the internet routing logs. We downloaded the exact digital timestamps of every single fraudulent loan application submitted from Richard's computer. We built an impenetrable, perfectly documented digital fortress of evidence around his crimes. Julian stood beside me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching the final pieces of criminal evidence compile into a secure, highly encrypted digital folder on my desktop. He shook his head slowly, amazed by the sheer stupidity of the man who used to be his father-in-law. He actually thinks he is getting away with it, Julian whispered into the quiet room. He is sitting in his office right now looking at that pending loan approval screen, honestly thinking he just saved his empire. Let him think that, I replied, closing the laptop with a soft, definitive click. Let him feel the relief. Let him believe he has successfully cheated the system one more time. Because when the heavy iron hammer finally drops, I want him to know exactly whose hand was swinging it. I walked back to the chessboard and looked down at the carved wooden pieces. I reached out and moved my knight, placing the opposing king in an absolutely inescapable, brutal check. Richard was currently thrashing in the mud, pulling innocent working-class people down into the dirt with him, desperately trying to keep his head above the rising water. He had absolutely no idea that I had just quietly drained the entire swamp. The digital dossier was completely sealed. The evidence of his federal crimes was irrefutable. I had the exact weapon I needed to permanently erase him from the corporate world and lock him inside a concrete cell. All that was left was to choose the perfect, most devastating moment to deliver the final killing blow. When a parasite realizes that the host organism has permanently severed the connection, it does not just gracefully die. It digs its claws in deeper. It tries to burrow into the softest, most vulnerable tissue it can find. I knew Chloe and her parents were completely bankrupt. I knew they had been thrown out of their luxury hotel. I knew Richard was facing federal prison for mass identity theft. But I underestimated just how dirty Chloe was willing to get to save her own skin. I do not live in a massive mansion. I own the $10 million estate my son and his wife lived in, but my personal home is a modest single-story brick house in a quiet working-class neighborhood. It has a small front porch, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a large detached garage where I restore antique engines. My neighbors are honest, hardworking people. They know me as Nate the mechanic. They do not know I am a multimillionaire. They just know I am a quiet old black man who minds his own business and keeps his property clean. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The neighborhood was peaceful. I was sitting on my front porch, drinking a glass of iced tea, enjoying the warm breeze. Then the absolute silence was shattered by the sound of tires screeching against the asphalt. A battered yellow city taxi abruptly pulled up to the curb in front of my house. The back door swung open and Chloe stumbled out. She did not look like the arrogant elite socialite who had tried to banish me to the kitchen just a few days ago. Her designer clothes were rumpled and stained. Her expensive hair was a tangled mess. She had dark circles under her eyes, and she was visibly shaking. She did not have her platinum credit cards, her luxury SUV, or her wealthy parents to hide behind anymore. She was completely stripped of her armor. But a manipulator never comes unarmed. If they do not have money or power, they use pity. And Chloe was about to deploy the most toxic, manipulative weapon in human history. She did not walk up my driveway and knock on my door like a normal person seeking a private conversation. She needed an audience. She needed leverage. She walked right into the center of my front yard, collapsed onto her knees in the green grass, and began to wail. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, hysterical, theatrical scream, designed specifically to draw as much attention as possible. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently, making absolutely sure that her voice carried down the entire street. Nathaniel, Chloe screamed, her voice echoing off the brick houses. "Please, Nathaniel, you have to help me. You have to tell Julian to come back." I did not jump out of my chair. I set my glass of iced tea down on the small wooden table next to me. I stood up slowly, walked to the edge of my porch, and looked down at her. I kept my face entirely expressionless. Within 30 seconds, front doors all up and down the street began to open. My neighbors' people who had known me for 20 years stepped out onto their porches. Miss Mabel, an elderly woman who lived next door, stopped watering her rose bushes and stared over the chain-link fence. Two men working on a car across the street put down their wrenches and turned to look. They saw a young, disheveled white woman kneeling in the dirt, crying hysterically in the front yard of an elderly black man. It was a highly calculated optical trap. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She was using the historical, deeply ingrained racial dynamics of this country to paint herself as a helpless, victimized woman begging for mercy from a cruel, unfeeling family. I walked down the 3 concrete steps of my porch and stood at the edge of the lawn. I did not step onto the grass. I did not reach out to help her up. I just looked at her. "Get up, Chloe," I said, my voice low and steady. You are making a spectacle of yourself in front of my neighbors. If you have something to say it like an adult." She looked up at me. Her face was covered in tears, but behind the wet red eyes I could see the cold, calculating gears of a predator turning. She knew she had the attention of the entire street. Now she was going to drop the bomb. She placed both of her trembling hands over her flat stomach. She looked around at the neighbors watching from their porches, making sure they were all listening. And then she looked back at me. "How can you be so cruel?" Chloe sobbed, raising her voice even louder. "Julian threw me out on the street. He froze all of my bank accounts. He left me with absolutely nothing. And he knows I am pregnant, Nathaniel. I am carrying your grandchild. I am carrying the Rollins heir." The word hung in the humid afternoon air like a live hand grenade. "Pregnant." I heard an audible gasp from Miss Mabel next door. The murmuring across the street grew louder. The neighbors were exchanging shocked, sympathetic whispers. Chloe had just played the ultimate dirty card. She had publicly accused my son of abandoning his pregnant wife, leaving her completely destitute and homeless. In the court of public opinion, a pregnant woman is bulletproof. By weaponizing an unborn child, she instantly transformed Julian into a monster and me into a complicit, heartless old man. Chloe saw the reaction of the crowd. She knew her trap was working perfectly. She leaned into the performance, crying even harder, rocking back and forth on her knees. "He will not even answer my phone calls," Chloe wailed, pointing an accusing finger at me. "I have nowhere to go. I am sleeping in a cheap motel. I cannot afford to eat. I cannot afford prenatal vitamins. How can you let your own son do this to his unborn child? You are a grandfather, Nathaniel. This baby has your blood. Are you really going to let your own flesh and blood starve on the street just because you do not like me?" It was a masterclass in emotional extortion. She was putting a gun to my head. She was demanding that I open my wallet, restore her luxury lifestyle, and force Julian to take her back, all under the threat of publicly destroying our family name and endangering a supposed innocent child. She thought she had completely checkmated me. She thought I would panic, rush out to the lawn, help her up, and usher her inside the house to avoid the public shame. She did not realize that a man who has lived through the 1960s on the south side of Chicago does not get intimidated by a loud, crying white woman on his front lawn. I have seen real pain. I have seen real suffering. I know the difference between a desperate mother and a greedy actress looking for a payday. I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not look around at my whispering neighbors to try and defend myself. I kept my eyes locked directly on Chloe's tear-stained face. "You are lying," I said. I did not shout it. I spoke the words with such quiet, absolute certainty that they cut right through her hysterical sobbing. Chloe blinked. Her theatrical crying paused for a fraction of a second. The sudden break in her character was entirely visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. Then she quickly recovered, clutching her stomach even tighter. "I am not lying!" she screamed, her voice taking on a shrill, defensive edge. "I have the ultrasound paperwork right here in my purse. I am 2 months pregnant. I went to the doctor last week. Julian knows about it. He is running away from his responsibilities. You have to give me money, Nathaniel. I need $5 million right now to secure a safe environment for this baby, or I am going to the press. I will go to the news stations. I will tell the entire city that the great Julian Rollins abandoned his pregnant wife to starve." There it was. The actual motive. $5 million. The baby was not a blessing to her. The baby was a ransom note. Ransom. She was trying to extort a massive cash settlement to replace the luxury credit cards I had locked. She was trying to buy her parents out of their bankruptcy by holding a phantom child hostage. I did not argue with her. I did not ask to see the paperwork. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I kept my eyes on her as I dialed a single number and raised the phone to my ear. Julian answered on the first ring. "Your wife is kneeling in my front yard," I told my son, keeping my voice entirely calm and conversational. "She has drawn a rather large crowd. She is currently informing the entire neighborhood that she is 2 months pregnant with your child, and she is demanding $5 million in exchange for her silence." I heard a low, dark chuckle coming from the speaker of the phone. It was the sound of a predator watching its prey walk directly into a steel trap. "Is she really playing that card?" Julian asked, his voice completely devoid of panic or surprise. "She is putting on quite the performance," I replied. "She claims she has the ultrasound paperwork in her purse." "Keep her right there, Dad." Julian said, his tone shifting into absolute icy precision. Do not let her leave. I am 5 minutes away. I have something I need to show her. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked down at Chloe. She was staring up at me, her fake tears drying on her cheeks, a sudden flicker of uncertainty crossing her eyes. She expected me to write a check to make her go away. She did not expect me to call the very man she was accusing. Julian is on his way, I told her. I turned around, walked back up the concrete steps of my porch and sat back down in my chair. I picked up my glass of iced tea, took a slow sip, and looked out over my front lawn. We are going to sit here and wait, Chloe, I said. And when Julian gets here, we are going to look at your paperwork together. I hope for your sake you are a better liar than your father is a businessman. Chloe stayed on her knees in the grass. The crowd of neighbors watched in absolute, breathless silence. The trap was set. The final dirty card had been played. And my son was coming to burn her entire deck to the ground. The silence on my front lawn was heavy and suffocating. Chloe remained on her knees in the grass, but the theatrical sobbing had faded into a series of calculated sniffles. She kept her head bowed, occasionally looking up through her messy hair to make sure Miss Mabel and the other neighbors were still watching. She was playing the waiting game. She firmly believed that when Julian arrived, the sight of his pregnant wife kneeling in the dirt would completely break him. She thought his corporate armor would melt the second she shoved a piece of medical paper into his face. 5 minutes later, a sleek black sedan turned onto my quiet street. The engine purred smoothly as Julian pulled up right behind Chloe's battered yellow taxi. The doors of the surrounding houses seemed to open a little wider. The entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Julian stepped out of his car. He was not wearing his full suit jacket anymore, just a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing his expensive watch. He looked entirely relaxed. He did not look like a man rushing to save a family in crisis. He looked like a man arriving to take out the trash. He closed his car door and walked up my short driveway. He did not run. He took his time. The moment Chloe saw him, her entire demeanor shifted. The helpless crying victim routine vanished in an instant. She slowly stood up, brushing the dirt off the knees of her stained designer pants. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She reached into her expensive leather purse, the one she had desperately stuffed with stolen jewelry the night before, and pulled out a folded piece of glossy paper. Julian stopped a few feet away from her. He looked at her with the same clinical, empty expression he used to look at a bug on his windshield. Julian, Chloe said, her voice completely losing its hysterical edge. She sounded arrogant again. She sounded like she had just won the lottery. I did not want to do this out here in the open, but you and your father left me absolutely no choice. You forced my hand. Julian did not say a word. He just stood there waiting for her to hang herself. Chloe held up the glossy paper, unfolding it so Julian could see the grainy black and white image printed on it. This is an official ultrasound from my doctor, Chloe announced loudly, making absolutely sure her voice carried to the neighbors standing on their porches. I am exactly 8 weeks pregnant. I am carrying your child, Julian, the heir to the Rollins family. She took a step closer to him, shaking the paper slightly. She was vibrating with a toxic, triumphant energy. You thought you could just throw me out and freeze my accounts. Chloe sneered, a wicked, greedy smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. You thought you could leave me with nothing. But the law protects mothers, Julian. No judge in this state is going to let a wealthy corporate lawyer and his millionaire father abandon a pregnant woman. I will drag your name through the mud. I will go to every single news station in Chicago. I will tell them exactly how abusive and cruel you both are. Julian crossed his arms over his chest. Are you finished? He asked quietly. No, I am not finished. Chloe snapped, her eyes flashing with pure greed. Here is how this is going to work. You are going to transfer $5 million into an offshore account in my name by tomorrow morning. You are going to pay for my relocation to California. You're going to buy me a house, and you are going to pay for my living expenses until this baby is 18 years old. If you do not give me exactly what I want, I swear to God, Julian, I will take this baby far away, and you will never, ever see your child. I will erase you from the birth certificate. It was the ultimate extortion. She had laid all her cards on the table. She was demanding $5 million in exchange for the child, treating the pregnancy like a hostage negotiation. She stood there completely out of breath, waiting for Julian to surrender. She expected him to pull out his checkbook. She expected him to beg her to stay. Julian slowly reached out and took the ultrasound paper from her trembling hand. He did not look panicked. He did not look angry. He looked at the grainy image of the ultrasound, studying it for a few seconds. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated mockery. Julian looked up from the paper and stared directly into Chloe's triumphant eyes. "You are 8 weeks pregnant?" Julian asked, his voice echoing clearly across my front yard. "Yes," Chloe said, lifting her chin proudly. 8 weeks! And it is yours." Julian smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. "That is an absolute medical miracle," Julian said. His voice was smooth, loud, and perfectly enunciated. Chloe's arrogant smile faltered just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. Julian held the ultrasound paper up with 2 fingers, looking at it with absolute disgust. "It is a miracle," Julian repeated, raising his voice so the entire street could hear every single word. "Because exactly 1 year ago, I went to a private clinic downtown, and I had a complete irreversible vasectomy. The world seemed to stop spinning. The wind died down. The birds stopped singing. Chloe froze completely. Her jaw dropped. Her eyes widened so far they looked like they were going to pop out of her skull. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. You see, Chloe." Julian continued stepping right into her personal space, his voice dripping with pure lethal venom. "I scheduled that procedure the exact same week I hired a private investigator to follow you. The exact same week I found out you were spending your afternoons in a cheap motel room with your personal tennis coach." A collective, extremely loud gasp erupted from the neighbors. Miss Mabel actually dropped her watering can onto her driveway. It hit the concrete with a loud clatter. One of the mechanics across the street let out a low whistle. Julian let the paper slip from his fingers. The fake ultrasound fluttered through the air and landed right in the dirt at Chloe's feet. "I have known about the tennis coach for a year," Julian exposed, stripping her of every single shred of her dignity. "I knew about the embezzled money for 6 months. I let you stay in my house. I let you sleep in my bed. I let you play the loyal, superior wife while I quietly built an absolute fortress of evidence against you and your entire family." Chloe was shaking uncontrollably. She could not speak. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The ultimate dirty card she had just played had completely backfired, blowing up right in her face. She had publicly tried to extort $5 million from my son, only to publicly expose herself as a cheating, manipulative fraud. "You do not have a Rollins air in your stomach," Julian said, looking down at her with absolute revulsion. "You have the child of a broke tennis coach, and you just tried to commit federal extortion in front of a dozen witnesses." Julian turned his head and looked at the neighbors standing on their porches. He raised his hand in a polite wave. The neighbors, completely disgusted by Chloe, began shaking their heads and walking back into their homes, shutting their doors on her. The audience she had so desperately tried to weaponize had entirely turned against her. "You are nothing, Chloe," Julian whispered, leaning down so only she could hear the final crushing blow. "You have no money. You have no husband. Your parents are bankrupt, and your baby is going to grow up knowing that its mother is a thief, a liar, and a complete failure. Do not ever come near my father again." Julian turned his back on her. He walked up the concrete steps of my porch and stood beside me. We both looked down at the ruined woman kneeling in the grass. Chloe collapsed. The fake tears were gone. They were replaced by real, agonizing, gut-wrenching sobs. She curled into a ball right there in the dirt, clutching her empty purse, completely shattered. Her entire fake world, her unearned privilege, her arrogant entitlement, it was all gone. There were no escape routes left. The doors were completely sealed. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not offer to call her a cab. I picked up my glass of iced tea, turned around, and walked into my house. Julian followed right behind me. We shut the heavy front door, locked the deadbolt, and left her completely alone in the dirt, exactly where she belonged. There is a specific kind of heavy, suffocating silence that surrounds a dead factory. When the massive steel machinery stops moving and the assembly lines completely freeze, a building that size feels like a giant concrete tomb. For 30 long years, Richard walked through the front doors of his manufacturing plant like a conquering king. He firmly believed the steel beams and the pristine glass windows were monuments to his own superior intellect. He loved to stand on the elevated walkways, looking down at the hundreds of working-class people sweating on his floor, convinced that his white skin and his loud voice made him a master of the universe. He completely forgot that his entire empire was running on borrowed time, stolen credit, and my engineering patents. Today was the day the final brutal bill came due. I did not have to be there to witness it. I could have stayed in the quiet comfort of my living room and simply let my team of corporate attorneys send me an email when the deed was officially done. But when you are a black man who has spent his entire life watching arrogant men take the credit and the profits for your hard work, you earn the absolute right to watch their castles crumble into dust. I drove my old reliable pickup truck across town and parked it in an empty shaded lot directly across the street from Richard's massive manufacturing facility. I rolled down the window, poured a cup of hot black coffee from my thermos, and waited quietly for the final execution to begin. The massive employee parking lot, which was usually packed tightly with hundreds of cars by 8 in the morning, was completely empty. The loading docks were entirely bare. There were no delivery trucks, no forklifts moving pallets, no signs of life whatsoever. At exactly 9:00 in the morning, a slow, methodical procession of vehicles turned onto the wide industrial boulevard. There were no flashing sirens to announce their arrival. It was just the cold, incredibly efficient arrival of absolute corporate ruin. 2 county sheriff cruisers pulled up to the main gate, followed closely by 3 sleek black SUVs belonging to the federal bankruptcy receivers and the commercial bank representatives. They parked in a tight line right in front of the primary executive entrance. Right behind them, speeding recklessly down the road and swerving into the driveway, was Richard's luxury sedan. The car slammed on its brakes, parking haphazardly with 2 wheels up on the concrete curb. Richard jumped out of the driver's side door. Beatrice scrambled out of the passenger side. They both looked absolutely frantic, like animals running from a massive forest fire. The perfectly tailored suits and the arrogant country club confidence were entirely gone. Richard looked like a man who had not slept or eaten in a week. His face was a pale, sickly gray. His expensive hair was a tangled mess, his tie was undone, and his shirt was wrinkled. I watched from the quiet cabin of my truck across the street as Richard sprinted toward the front entrance, waving his arms wildly in the air. He was shouting at the men in the dark suits who were stepping out of the SUVs. I did not need to roll down my window to hear his exact words. I knew exactly what he was saying. He was using his loud, booming chief executive voice. He was demanding respect. He was telling the federal receivers that there had been a massive clerical error. He was frantically trying to use his social status, his perceived privilege, and his aggressive physical posture to intimidate the bank officials. He honestly expected them to bow their heads, apologize for the inconvenience, and give him another financial extension. But the men in the dark suits did not care about his elite country club memberships. They did not care who he played golf with or what neighborhood he lived in. The federal government and the commercial banks only cared about the massive gaping hole in their financial ledgers and the severe federal identity theft he had committed to try and cover it up. The lead bank receiver did not even blink at Richard's screaming. He simply held up a thick, heavy stack of official court documents, completely ignoring the desperate man waving his arms. The receiver gave a short, silent nod to the uniformed sheriffs. The officers walked right past Richard, completely brushing him aside as if he were nothing more than a ghost. They carried heavy industrial steel chains and massive brass padlocks. They marched up the concrete steps to the executive entrance. They wrapped the thick steel chains tightly through the handles of the massive glass doors, locking them shut with a loud, definitive clanking sound that echoed across the empty asphalt of the parking lot. Then one of the sheriffs reached into his heavy-duty bag and pulled out a staple gun and a large, bright, neon orange legal document. It was the official notice of commercial foreclosure, severe federal asset seizure, and complete business liquidation. The officer slapped the neon orange paper right in the dead center of the pristine glass doors. He drove the heavy metal staples in hard. That bright orange paper is the ultimate undeniable mark of absolute shame in the corporate manufacturing world. It is a glaring beacon that tells everyone driving by that the man who owned this building is a complete, utter failure. It tells the entire world that he could not pay his debts, that he lied to his investors, that he stole from his own employees, and that his kingdom has been permanently repossessed by the state. Beatrice let out a loud, dramatic wail that carried all the way across the street to my truck. She covered her face with her trembling hands, completely mortified. But I knew she was not crying for the hundreds of innocent factory workers who had just lost their jobs and their livelihoods because of her husband's greed. She was crying because her elite social status had just been publicly violently executed in broad daylight. Richard completely stopped yelling. His arms fell limply to his sides. He stood frozen in front of the heavily chained doors, staring blankly at the bright neon orange paper. The realization was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. The illusion was dead. He was no longer a powerful, untouchable chief executive. He was a bankrupt fraud, standing on the wrong side of a locked door, waiting for a federal indictment. But the universe was not quite done crushing him yet. As Richard stood there in absolute catatonic shock, two incredibly expensive foreign sports cars pulled slowly into the edge of the parking lot. I immediately recognized the two men who stepped out of the vehicles. They were Richard's primary corporate investors and his closest, most trusted friends from his exclusive country club. They were the men he drank expensive aged scotch with, the men he constantly bragged to about his superiority and his brilliant business acumen. They had undoubtedly heard the rapid whispers of the federal fraud investigation and the sudden factory shutdown, and they had driven down to see the wreckage of the empire for themselves. Richard turned his head and saw them. A desperate, pathetic, sickening glimmer of hope flashed across his pale face. He turned away from the chained doors and started walking quickly toward his wealthy friends. He reached his hands out in front of him, probably planning to beg for a massive emergency bridge loan. He was probably formulating a frantic lie in his head, preparing to tell them that this was all a temporary misunderstanding caused by a vindictive, crazy black mechanic who had stolen his patents. But his elite friends did not step forward to greet him. They did not offer him a warm, reassuring handshake or a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. As Richard approached them, the two wealthy men literally took a physical step backward. They recoiled from him as if he were covered in toxic waste. The looks on their faces were not filled with pity or concern. Their faces were twisted into masks of pure, unfiltered disgust. They looked at Richard as if he were carrying a highly contagious, lethal disease. In their ruthless world of extreme wealth and high society, financial failure and federal fraud are the ultimate pathogens. You do not associate with a man who has a neon orange foreclosure notice stapled to his front door. You do not lend money to a man who steals the identities of his own janitors. You cut him off completely and immediately to protect your own pristine reputation. One of the men slowly shook his head, raised his hand in a sharp cutting motion to stop Richard from coming any closer, and then turned his back completely. The other man did the exact same thing. They got back into their expensive sports cars, started their loud engines, and drove away without saying a single word to him. They left him standing entirely alone on the hot asphalt of the parking lot. Richard stood there completely abandoned by the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. His massive company was sealed shut with heavy chains. His wealth was completely vaporized. His daughter was utterly ruined and living in a cheap motel. His elite friends had treated him like a diseased leper. The arrogant, untouchable white man who had crushed my father's antique watch under his heel had been reduced to absolutely nothing. I watched him slowly sink down onto the concrete curb, burying his face deep in his hands, while his wife sobbed uncontrollably beside him. I did not honk the horn of my truck. I did not roll down my window to shout at him or gloat over his misery. A lion does not need to roar over the broken bones of a scavenger. The silence is powerful enough. I simply started. The engine of my old reliable truck took one last highly satisfying sip of my hot coffee and drove quietly down the street. I left them sitting in the dirt, completely trapped in the suffocating nightmare they had built entirely with their own two hands. When a proud man loses a fair fight, he accepts his defeat and faces the consequences. But when a coward realizes the entire world has discovered his lies, his first and only instinct is to run. Richard was not a proud man. He was a coward wrapped in an expensive suit. He stood in that empty parking lot staring at the heavy chains on his factory doors, and he made the worst decision of his entire miserable life. He decided to flee. I knew exactly what he was going to do before he even put the key into his ignition. I had spent decades studying men like him. They believe that consequences are only meant for poor people. They believe that if they just drive fast enough, their wealth and their white skin will somehow create a magical force field around them. Richard left his crying wife standing on the sidewalk. He drove straight to his empty, foreclosed mansion. He ignored the packing boxes. He walked straight into his home office, opened his hidden wall safe, and pulled out a heavy canvas duffel bag. He stuffed it with the remaining offshore cash he had stolen using his employees' identities. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable bills. He grabbed his passport, tossed the bag into the trunk of his luxury sedan, and aimed his car toward the interstate highway. He was heading for the state line, planning to vanish into the wind. He thought he was making a clean getaway. He had no idea that I had already locked the doors to his cage hours ago. While Richard was busy throwing a tantrum in front of his locked factory, my son Julian and I were sitting comfortably in my study. We had the encrypted digital folder containing every single piece of evidence proving Richard's federal crimes. The forged loan applications, the stolen social security numbers of his factory workers, the offshore routing data, and the exact timestamps matching his computer. We did not call the local police. Local police can be swayed by a rich man with a good lawyer. We went straight to the top. Julian used his high-level corporate contacts to submit the entire dossier directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal government does not mess around when it comes to massive identity theft and corporate wire fraud. When they saw the sheer volume of evidence we provided wrapped up with a perfect bow, they moved with terrifying speed. A federal magistrate signed an emergency arrest warrant within the hour. They flagged Richard's license plate, his passport, and his facial recognition profile across every major highway camera network leaving the city of Chicago. I was sitting in the passenger seat of Julian's car. We were driving down the interstate a few miles behind Richard. We were not chasing him. We were just enjoying the ride, listening to the police scanner Julian had tuned on his phone. We wanted to be there for the final curtain call. I pictured Richard sitting behind the steering wheel of his expensive car. I could imagine the sweat dripping down his forehead, soaking into his wrinkled collar. His heart was probably hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was checking his rearview mirror every 10 seconds, terrified of every flashing light. He was pressing the gas pedal down hard, pushing the heavy engine to its absolute limit, desperate to cross the border and escape his reality. The sky was clear, the sun was shining brightly, and the highway was wide open. Richard saw the massive concrete canopy of the interstate toll plaza looming in the distance. In his desperate, panicked mind, that toll booth represented freedom. He believed that once he passed through those concrete barriers and crossed the state line, he would be untouchable. He would find a quiet town, buy a new identity with his stolen cash, and start his life over. He slowed his luxury sedan down, merging into the electronic pass lane. He took a deep breath, gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He rolled down his window to let the cool air hit his sweating face. He never even made it to the scanner. As his car rolled into the narrow concrete lane of the toll plaza, the trap violently snapped shut. It was a masterpiece of tactical precision. Out of nowhere, 3 massive black federal tactical vehicles swarmed the toll booth. They did not use their sirens. They moved with silent, deadly efficiency. One massive SUV violently swerved right in front of Richard's car, cutting off his forward escape route completely. The heavy steel bumper missed his grille by mere inches. Before Richard could even react, the second SUV slammed on its brakes directly behind his bumper, locking him in from the rear. The third vehicle boxed him in on the side. He was completely trapped inside a narrow concrete corridor surrounded by federal armor. The doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured out onto the pavement. They were wearing dark tactical gear, bulletproof vests with the bright yellow letters FBI across their chests, and they had their weapons drawn and aimed directly at Richard's windshield. The sheer overwhelming force of the federal government had descended upon him in a matter of seconds. "Turn off the engine," a federal agent roared through a megaphone, his voice echoing off the concrete canopy. "Put your hands out the window where we can see them. Do it now." Richard sat frozen in the driver's seat. He looked at the guns pointed at his face. He looked at the heavy tactical vests. The illusion of his supreme white privilege completely shattered right there in the front seat of his car. He finally realized that his money could not buy his way out of this. His country club friends could not save him. His loud, booming voice meant absolutely nothing to men who were trained to take down actual cartels. He was not a king anymore. He was just a pathetic, trembling criminal caught red-handed. His shaking hands slowly crept out of the open window. 2 federal agents immediately rushed forward. They did not ask him politely to step out of the vehicle. They grabbed the handle, yanked the heavy door open, and pulled him out of the expensive leather seat. Richard let out a high-pitched squeal of panic as he was roughly spun around. They slammed his chest against the hood of his own car. The hot metal burned through his thin, sweat-soaked shirt. An agent kicked his legs apart, forcing him into a wide, humiliating stance. Julian pulled our car over onto the shoulder of the highway a safe distance away from the tactical operation. We sat in silence watching the scene unfold through the windshield. I watched the federal agent reach onto his heavy utility belt and pull out a pair of solid steel handcuffs. I watched him grab Richard's soft manicured wrists, pull them forcefully behind his back, and snap the cold metal closed. The sharp mechanical click of the locking mechanism carried clearly through the air. I looked at those steel cuffs locking his hands together. Those were the exact same hands that had signed fraudulent loan documents to steal from hardworking janitors. I looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. Those were the exact same shoes he had used to maliciously grind my father's antique silver watch into the marble floor, completely destroying a piece of my family history, just to make himself feel superior. He thought he could stomp on my legacy and walk away without a single scratch. Now he was going to walk into a federal penitentiary wearing those exact same shoes, completely stripped of his name, his dignity, and his freedom. The agents patted him down, found the keys to the trunk, and popped it open. They pulled out the heavy canvas duffel bag, filled with the stolen offshore cash. The final piece of undeniable evidence was secured. They grabbed Richard by his upper arms, marched him toward the back of a black SUV, and shoved him roughly into the back seat. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing his fate forever. Julian turned the steering wheel and slowly merged our car back onto the highway, driving right past the scene of the arrest. I did not look back. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a profound, quiet peace settle over my spirit. The long arm of the law had finally caught up with the man who thought he was above it, and justice had never tasted so sweet. The halls of a county courthouse are a fascinating place to observe human nature. It is a place where all the expensive clothes, the loud voices, and the fake social statuses are completely stripped away. When you walk through those heavy oak doors and stand before a judge, the only thing that matters is the absolute documented truth. For a woman like Chloe, who had spent her entire life hiding behind her white privilege, her wealthy parents, and a carefully constructed wall of lies, a courtroom was the most dangerous place on earth. She could not manipulate the law the way she manipulated people. I walked beside my son Julian up the wide marble steps of the courthouse. It was a crisp, clear Friday morning. Julian was wearing a sharply tailored dark blue suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He walked with the relaxed, effortless confidence of an apex predator entering his natural hunting ground. Julian is a senior corporate litigator. He spends his life in rooms just like this one, dismantling hostile corporations and destroying arrogant executives. Today, he was bringing that exact same ruthless legal precision to his own marriage. I walked right beside him in my simple brown corduroy jacket, my hands resting comfortably in my pockets. I was there to witness the final chapter. We walked through the metal detectors and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom number 4. The room was quiet, smelling of old wood and floor wax. Chloe was already sitting at the respondent's table. When I looked at her, I almost did not recognize the woman sitting in that wooden chair. The glamorous, arrogant socialite who had hosted that lavish birthday party just a few weeks ago was completely gone. She looked absolutely hollow. She was wearing a plain off-the-rack beige dress that hung loosely on her frame. Her expensive blonde hair was tied back in a messy knot. She had deep dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the cheap plastic pen resting on the table in front of her. But the most glaring detail was the empty wooden chair right next to her. She was completely alone. There was no Arthur Vance sitting beside her. The notorious cutthroat divorce lawyer she and her father had bragged about had thrown them out of his office the moment I tripled his commercial rent. Because her bank accounts were frozen and her parents were entirely bankrupt, Chloe could not afford to hire another attorney. She had no legal counsel. She had no father to hide behind because Richard was currently sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for his embezzlement trial. She had no mother to comfort her because Beatrice was hiding in a cheap motel, terrified of the public humiliation. Chloe was facing the sharpest legal mind in the city entirely by herself. Julian pulled out his chair at the petitioner's table and sat down. He did not look at her. He opened his leather briefcase and neatly arranged 3 small, very thin folders on the table. He did not need a massive box of documents. When you have the absolute truth on your side, the paperwork is incredibly light. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. An older, stern-looking woman with gray hair and sharp eyes took her seat behind the high wooden bench. She looked down at the docket, adjusted her glasses, and then looked out at the two tables. The judge immediately noticed the empty chair next to Chloe. She asked Chloe if she was representing herself today. Chloe stood up. Her legs were trembling. She immediately tried to play the only card she knew how to play. She burst into tears. She tried to use her trembling voice and her crying eyes to manipulate the judge. She sobbed loudly, claiming that she was a victim of severe financial abuse. She told the judge that her cruel, vindictive husband had maliciously frozen all of her bank accounts, leaving her destitute and entirely unable to afford legal representation. She begged the court for mercy, asking the judge to order Julian to pay her a massive emergency settlement so she could survive. The judge did not look sympathetic. Judges deal with professional liars every single day. The judge calmly instructed Chloe to sit down and stop the theatrical crying. The court operates on evidence, not emotions. The judge turned her attention to Julian and asked him to proceed with his petition for dissolution of marriage. Julian stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. His voice was incredibly calm, respectful, and terrifyingly clinical. "Your Honor," Julian said smoothly, "the respondent is correct that her access to certain financial accounts has been restricted. However, those accounts were not marital assets. They were corporate expense accounts belonging to my father's logistics firm, which she was actively using to embezzle funds. But we do not need to argue about the division of marital assets today, Your Honor. Because according to the legally binding contract signed by both parties, there are no marital assets to divide." Julian picked up the first thin folder from his table. He walked forward and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "I submit Exhibit A," Julian announced, "a comprehensive prenuptial agreement signed and notarized by both myself and the respondent exactly 3 years ago." I remembered the day Chloe signed that document. I remembered it perfectly. Julian had brought the paperwork to a family dinner. Chloe had been drinking expensive champagne, laughing loudly with her friends, bragging about how she was marrying a highly successful lawyer who was going to buy her a mansion. Julian had placed the 50-page legal document on the table and told her she needed to have her own independent lawyer review it before signing. Chloe had simply laughed in his face. She was so blinded by her own arrogance, so utterly convinced of her own superiority, that she thought the contract was just a silly standard formality. She honestly believed that her status as a beautiful white woman from a supposedly wealthy family made her completely bulletproof. She did not bother to read a single paragraph. She did not hire a lawyer to look at the clauses. She just flipped directly to the very last page, signed her name with a flourish, and went back to drinking her champagne. She had no idea that she had just signed away every single legal right she would ever have. "Your Honor," Julian continued, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom, "if you direct your attention to Section 4, Paragraph B, you will see a highly specific infidelity and financial fraud clause. I drafted that clause myself. It explicitly states that in the event the respondent commits documented adultery or engages in the unauthorized diversion of marital funds, the prenuptial agreement is immediately triggered. Under this clause, the respondent completely and permanently forfeits any and all rights to spousal support, alimony, property division, and emergency maintenance." Chloe jumped up from her chair, her face turning a blotchy, panicked red. "That is a lie," she screamed, pointing at Julian. "He is lying. I did not read that. I did not know that was in there. He tricked me into signing it. You cannot enforce that." The judge banged her gavel loudly, ordering Chloe to remain silent or be held in contempt of court. The judge looked down at the document, verifying the signatures and the notary's stamps. The judge then looked at Julian and asked if he had the necessary burden of proof to trigger the forfeiture clause. Julian did not even blink. He picked up the second and third folders from his table and handed them to the bailiff. "I submit Exhibit B and Exhibit C," Julian stated calmly. Exhibit B contains a comprehensive report from a licensed private investigator, including high-definition photographs and hotel registry logs, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the respondent maintained a sexual affair with her tennis instructor for over a year. Exhibit C contains the digital banking logs, forged signature authorizations, and routing numbers, proving that the respondent embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from our personal accounts to fund her father's failing manufacturing company. The judge opened the folders. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the crisp sound of paper turning. The judge spent 5 long minutes reviewing the undeniable airtight evidence Julian had meticulously compiled over the last 6 months. The photographs were clear. The financial records were irrefutable. The trap my son had built was completely flawless. Chloe was hyperventilating at her table. She had her head buried in her hands, rocking back and forth. The absolute reality of her stupidity was finally crushing her. She had willingly signed the weapon that was currently being used to execute her. The judge closed the folders and looked down at Chloe with an expression of absolute, unfiltered disdain. "Ignorance of a contract you willingly signed is not a valid legal defense in this courtroom," the judge said, her voice hard and uncompromising. "The evidence of adultery and financial fraud is overwhelming and undisputed. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad, and I find it completely enforceable under the laws of this state." The judge picked up her pen and began signing the final divorce decree. "The marriage is hereby dissolved," the judge announced. "By the terms of your own signed agreement, the respondent is awarded absolutely nothing. No spousal support, no alimony, no division of property. You will leave this marriage with the exact same assets you brought into it, which according to this documentation is 0. Furthermore, the respondent is ordered to pay her own legal fees." The judge raised her wooden gavel and brought it down with a heavy echoing crack. "Court is adjourned." The sound of that gavel was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a parasite being legally and permanently detached from my family. Julian quietly packed his empty folders back into his leather briefcase. He snapped the lock shut, turned around, and walked down the aisle toward me. He did not look back at the woman weeping at the table. We walked out of the courtroom together and stepped into the long, echoing hallway of the courthouse. We only made it a few steps before we heard the frantic slapping of shoes behind us. Chloe pushed through the swinging wooden doors and ran toward us. She threw herself onto the marble floor, grabbing the fabric of Julian's tailored pants. "Julian, please!" she wailed, her voice echoing down the entire corridor. People passing by stopped and stared. "You cannot leave me like this. I have nothing. I cannot afford to eat. I cannot afford a place to sleep. Please, just give me a small settlement. Just give me $10,000 to start over. Please, I am begging you." Julian looked down at her. He did not kick her away, but he gently and firmly pulled his leg out of her desperate grasp. He looked at the woman who had stolen from him, lied to him, and conspired with her arrogant father to destroy his career. "Call the tennis coach," Julian said softly. "I am sure he has a spare couch you can sleep on." Julian turned around and continued walking toward the exit. I followed right beside him. We walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped into the bright, warm sunlight of the city. I looked over my shoulder one last time. I saw Chloe slowly pushing the glass doors open, walking out into the sun with absolutely nothing but the cheap dress on her back. She had no money, no family to save her, and no more lies to hide behind. She had tried to play a dangerous game with a family of survivors, and she had walked away with empty hands and a completely ruined life. When a massive tree falls in the forest, it crushes everything in its immediate path. Richard was the tree. He was currently sitting in a cold concrete federal holding cell without bail, facing a decade in prison for identity theft and wire fraud. Chloe was the branch that snapped off, wandering the city with a single cheap suitcase, completely divorced and entirely broke. But there was one final piece of the rotting stump left to deal with. Beatrice. For 30 years, Beatrice had played the role of the perfect, wealthy, upper-class matriarch. She wore the expensive pearls, she hosted the charity galas, she looked down her surgically enhanced nose at working-class people, and she especially looked down on me. She thought her wealth made her royalty, and her white skin made her untouchable. But a woman like Beatrice does not actually have any power of her own. Her entire identity was completely tethered to her husband's bank account and her daughter's fake social climbing. With both of those things utterly destroyed, she was nothing but a hollow, bitter shell sitting in a cheap roadside motel room, hiding from the crushing public humiliation. I was sitting in my detached garage on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The air smelled of old motor oil and aged wood. I was working on a beautiful vintage 1968 Mustang engine. My hands were covered in a thin layer of grease, exactly the way I like them. I was at peace. My son Julian was finally free from his toxic marriage. My patents were secure. My fortune was intact. The trash had been taken out, or so I thought. My cell phone buzzed loudly on the metal workbench. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and picked it up. The screen displayed an unknown number. I am a patient man. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened. Nathaniel, a shrill, trembling voice hissed through the speaker. It was Beatrice. Her voice was completely unrecognizable. The polite, refined country club accent was entirely gone. It was replaced by a raw, guttural, venomous tone that sounded like a wounded animal backed into a dark corner. She was hyperventilating. She was drunk on cheap wine and absolute despair. I reached out with my thumb and quietly pressed the record button on my screen. I did not say a word. I just let the tape roll. "Are you happy now?" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You ruined my family. You destroyed my husband. You threw my daughter out onto the street. You took everything from us." I let her scream. I let the silence on my end agitate her further. When an arrogant person realizes they have absolutely no power, their final resort is always to try and inflict emotional pain. Beatrice realized she could not sue me. She could not intimidate me. She had no corporate executives to call, so she decided to pull off her mask completely and show me the ugly, rotting racist core of her soul. "You think you are so smart?" Beatrice spat, her words slurring together with pure hatred. "You think because you have a little bit of money now you are better than us. You will never be better than us. You are nothing but a dirty, worthless old mechanic. You do not belong in our world. You never did." She did not stop there. The dam completely broke. Decades of ingrained upper-class bigotry spilled out of her mouth like toxic sludge. She began to hurl the most vile, disgusting racial slurs imaginable. She used words that my father had to endure in the Jim Crow South. She used words that were specifically designed to strip a black man of his humanity and put him back in chains. She called me things I will not even repeat, her voice dripping with a sickening, desperate superiority. She cursed my late wife Vivica. She cursed my son Julian. "I will kill you!" Beatrice shrieked, entirely losing her grip on reality. "I swear to God, Nathaniel, I will find a way to make you pay for this. I will burn your house down. I will destroy your life just like you destroyed mine. You are going to die in the gutter exactly where your kind belongs." She was panting heavily, completely out of breath from her racist, homicidal tirade. She waited for me to yell back. She wanted me to lose my temper. She wanted me to curse at her so she could feel like she had finally dragged me down into the mud with her. Instead, I simply cleared my throat. "Beatrice," I said, my voice completely calm, deep and steady. "Are you currently staying at the Starlight Motel on Highway 47? The sudden clinical calmness of my voice caught her completely off guard. She hesitated. "How do you know where I am?" she stammered, the fear suddenly piercing through her drunken rage. "I know exactly where you are," I replied smoothly. "And I just wanted to verify your identity for the audio recording I have been capturing for the last 3 minutes. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful evening." I pressed the red button and ended the call. I saved the audio file to my secure cloud server. I did not feel angry. I did not feel hurt by her racial slurs. The insults of a defeated, bankrupt woman hold absolutely no weight. They are just empty words floating in the wind. But her threats were a completely different story. Threatening to kill a man and burn his house down over a recorded telephone line is a very serious criminal offense. I washed the grease off my hands, went inside the house and put on a clean shirt. I drove my truck directly to the local police precinct. I did not call a lawyer to handle this for me. I wanted to hand-deliver the final nail in the coffin myself. I walked up to the front desk and asked to speak with a detective. A young, sharp-looking detective brought me into a small interview room. I sat down across from him, placed my phone on the metal table and played the recording. The detective listened in absolute silence. He heard the venom. He heard the horrific racial slurs. And most importantly, he heard the explicit, unhinged death threats. When the recording finished, the detective shook his head in absolute disgust. He looked at me with deep professional respect. "Mr. Rollins," the detective said, "this is textbook terroristic threatening and severe harassment. We take this very seriously. We can have an emergency restraining order issued by a judge within the hour." I nodded slowly. "I want a full permanent order of protection," I told him. "For myself, for my son Julian, and for our respective properties. I want her legally barred from coming within 500 feet of our lives." The legal process was incredibly swift. By 8 o'clock that evening, a county judge had signed the emergency restraining order. Two uniformed police officers drove directly to the Starlight Motel on Highway 47. They found Beatrice sitting in her cheap, dimly lit room surrounded by empty wine bottles and dirty clothes. They did not treat her like a wealthy socialite. They treated her like a dangerous, unhinged criminal. They handed her the thick stack of legal documents. They informed her that she was legally prohibited from contacting me or my family ever again. They told her that if she violated the order, she would be immediately arrested and placed in a county jail cell right alongside her disgraced husband. But the legal action was only half of the execution. In the elite upper-class circles that Beatrice used to rule public records are the ultimate weapon. News of the police visit and the severe restraining order spread through the country club gossip network faster than a wildfire. The specific details of her drunken, racist, homicidal phone call became public knowledge. In a world that values polite appearances above all else, being exposed as an unhinged, violent bigot is the absolute end of the line. The few remaining friends who had offered her tiny shreds of sympathy completely cut her off. Her prestigious country club membership was formally and permanently revoked by the board of directors. The charity organizations she used to chair publicly distanced themselves, rushing to erase her name from their donor walls and letterheads. She was entirely excommunicated from the only world she cared about. Richard was locked in a federal penitentiary. Chloe was working a minimum wage job and sleeping on a broken couch. And Beatrice was permanently branded as a toxic racist criminal, completely banished from the high society she had worshipped her entire life. Their family name was officially wiped off the map. The cleansing was finally complete. The massive rotting tree had been completely uprooted, chopped into pieces, and burned to ash. The ground was clear. I drove back to my quiet brick house, parked my truck in the driveway, and walked up to my front porch. The night air was cool and incredibly peaceful. I had protected my son. I had protected my legacy. I had taken out the trash, and my world had never felt so perfectly clean. When a massive hurricane finally breaks and the dark clouds roll away, the world is left in a state of absolute, profound stillness. The chaotic winds die down. The deafening thunder stops. You walk outside, take a deep breath of the cool, clean air, and you realize that the foundation of your house is still standing strong. The storm came. It tried to tear the roof off, but it failed. That was exactly how my quiet, working-class neighborhood felt on a late Saturday afternoon. The long, exhausting war was officially over. The toxic, parasitic family that had tried to infect our lives had been completely eradicated from our world. Richard was sitting in a federal prison cell. Beatrice was banished from society. Chloe was a distant, fading memory. The dust had finally settled. I was in my sanctuary. My detached garage is not just a place where I park my truck. It is a working mechanic shop filled with the rich, comforting smells of aged motor oil, fresh sawdust, and old steel. It is the place where I built my very first bypass valve decades ago. It is the place where my late wife Vivica used to sit on a wooden stool drinking sweet tea and watching me work until the sun went down. The late afternoon sunlight was streaming through the high, dusty windows, casting long, golden shadows across my heavy metal workbench. I heard the familiar low rumble of a car engine pulling into my driveway. I did not need to look out the window to know who it was. The heavy wooden door of the garage slowly creaked open. My son Julian stepped inside. He did not look like the ruthless, cold corporate attorney who had just systematically dismantled a wealthy family in a county courthouse. He just looked like my son. The heavy burden of his toxic marriage was completely gone from his shoulders. He looked 10 years younger. Julian took off his expensive suit jacket, draped it carefully over the back of a worn wooden chair, and slowly rolled the sleeves of his crisp white shirt up to his elbows. He walked over to the small, beat-up refrigerator sitting in the corner of the shop, pulled out 2 cold bottles of root beer, and popped the caps off with an old metal wrench. He walked over to my workbench, handed me a bottle, and sat down on the wooden stool directly across from me. We did not exchange a loud, dramatic greeting. We just sat there in the quiet golden light, drinking our root beer and listening to the soft hum of the old radio playing in the background. For a long time, neither of us said a word. When you and your son have just navigated a treacherous minefield together and survived without a single scratch, words feel completely unnecessary. We were just enjoying the absolute peace of each other's company. Julian looked around the garage, his eyes scanning the tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, the old engine blocks resting on the concrete floor, and the familiar, comforting clutter of his childhood. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean air fill his lungs. "It is finally over," Dad Julian said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep relief. "The final divorce decrees are filed. The corporate restructuring of their assets is completely finished. I do not ever have to look at them, speak to them, or hear their names ever again. The house is completely empty." I nodded slowly, taking a sip from my cold bottle. "You performed a very difficult surgery, Julian," I told him. "You had a cancer growing inside your home. It was spreading. It was trying to consume everything you worked so hard to build. Cutting it out is painful. It leaves a scar. But it is the only way you survive. You did exactly what your mother would have wanted you to do. You protected your peace, and you protected your dignity." Julian looked down at his hands, resting them on the scarred wood of the workbench. "I should have seen it sooner," he whispered, a hint of lingering regret in his tone. "I should have noticed the entitlement. I should have seen how she looked down on you. I let her bring her arrogant parents into our lives. I let them sit at my table and act like they owned the world. I wasted 3 years of my life trying to build a family with a woman who was actively trying to destroy mine." I reached out and placed my rough, calloused hand over his. "You did not waste your time, Julian," I said softly. "You learned a very valuable lesson about human nature. You learned that a beautiful face and a wealthy background do not make a person loyal. You learned how to spot a predator hiding in plain sight. That kind of wisdom does not come cheap. You paid a high price for it, but you will carry that knowledge for the rest of your life. You will never be fooled again." I stood up from my stool and walked over to the heavy iron safe tucked away in the back corner of the garage. I spun the combination dial, pulled the heavy steel door open, and reached inside. I pulled out a small, polished wooden box. It was the exact same box I had brought to his lavish 35th birthday party. The exact same box that Richard had snatched out of my hands. I walked back to the workbench and set the wooden box down gently in front of Julian. He looked at the box, and the relaxed expression on his face instantly tightened. The memory of that night, the humiliation, the sound of the glass shattering under Richard's expensive Italian leather shoe, rushed back into the room. Julian swallowed hard, staring at the closed lid. He remembered seeing the crushed silver casing and the bent metal hands resting in my palm. He remembered the absolute fury that had ignited in his chest. "Open it," I told him gently. Julian slowly reached out. His fingers trembled slightly as he unlatched the small brass hook. He lifted the wooden lid. His breath caught in his throat. Resting on a bed of dark blue velvet was his grandfather's antique pocket watch. It was not a pile of crushed silver and shattered glass anymore. It was absolutely breathtakingly perfect. The silver casing had been meticulously pounded out, smoothed and polished until it gleamed like a mirror in the afternoon sun. The shattered glass face had been completely replaced with a pristine, crystal-clear cover. The delicate, tiny metal hands that Richard had maliciously bent and twisted were perfectly straight, ticking with absolute rhythmic precision. Julian picked up the watch. He held it in the palm of his hand, bringing it closer to his face to examine the incredible craftsmanship. He could hear the soft, steady heartbeat of the internal gears turning inside the silver casing. Tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of a machine that had been completely resurrected from the dead. "How did you do this?" Julian whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I saw him step on it, Dad. I saw him crush it into the marble floor. The mainspring was completely destroyed. The gears were shattered. It was ruined beyond repair. I thought it was gone forever." I sat back down on my wooden stool and looked at my son. "Nothing is ever truly ruined beyond repair if you have the patience and the skill to put the pieces back together," I explained quietly. "I spent the last 3 weeks sitting right here at this workbench. I took a magnifying glass and a pair of tweezers. I cleaned every single microscopic gear. I reshaped the silver casing with a tiny hammer. I ordered a custom-cut piece of glass. I oiled the springs. I poured my sweat and my love into that metal just like my father did when he bought it with his very first paycheck from the steel mill. Richard thought he could destroy our history by stepping on it." I continued, my voice steady and proud. "He thought his expensive shoe and his white privilege were heavy enough to crush the legacy of a working-class black family. But he was wrong. He did not destroy the watch. He just gave me an opportunity to make it stronger. He gave me a chance to polish the silver until it shined brighter than it ever had before." Julian closed his hand around the pocket watch, holding it tightly against his chest. A single tear slipped down his cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He looked at me, the weight of the last 6 months finally lifting entirely from his soul. He realized that the watch was not just a birthday gift anymore. It was a perfect, shining metaphor for his own life. Chloe and her family had tried to crush his spirit. They had tried to shatter his future. But they had failed. He was still here, ticking with absolute precision, stronger and sharper than he had ever been. I reached across the workbench and gently squeezed his shoulder. "You were worried about the 3 years you spent married to that woman," I said softly, looking deep into his dark eyes. "You were worried that you wasted a chapter of your life on people who did not deserve your presence. But I want you to look at that watch, Julian, and I want you to remember something very important." I paused, letting the silence of the garage emphasize the weight of my next words. "Time is never truly lost, my son," I told him, speaking the absolute truth from the bottom of my heart. "It only teaches us who is actually worth spending our time on." Julian nodded slowly, wiping the tear from his cheek. He carefully placed the silver pocket watch into the breast pocket of his crisp white shirt right over his heart. He looked around the dusty, oil-stained garage, the sanctuary where the real wealth of our family had always been stored. He smiled a genuine, peaceful smile. The storm was over. The wreckage had been cleared away. The future was wide open, and the hands of the clock were moving perfectly forward. When you spend your entire life building a massive invisible fortress, you eventually have to decide who is going to man the walls when your time is finally done. For years, I operated entirely in the shadows. I hid my immense wealth behind the grease on my calloused hands and the dirt on my old work boots. I let the world think I was just a tired old mechanic because invisibility is the most powerful armor a black man can wear in a society that constantly looks for ways to tear him down. But the long, vicious war with Richard and his entitled daughter Chloe had permanently changed the landscape of our lives. The protective armor was no longer necessary. The parasites had been completely burned away by the bright, searing light of the absolute truth, and the soil around our family tree was finally clear of their toxic poison. It was time to plant new seeds. It was time to step out into the sun and ensure that the Rollins family legacy would stand tall and unbreakable long after my old bones turned to dust. Julian and I sat alone in the downtown executive boardroom of Apex Industrial Solutions. It was the primary corporate holding firm for all of my engineering patents, the massive silent engine that generated my generational wealth. The quiet room featured floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the sprawling, beautiful Chicago skyline. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany conference table, not in my old brown corduroy jacket, but in a custom-tailored dark charcoal suit. Julian sat directly to my right. He had officially and permanently resigned from his prestigious corporate law firm earlier that week. He did not need to fight legal battles to protect the assets of other wealthy men anymore. He was finally ready to command his own fleet. I reached across the table and slid a thick, heavy stack of transition documents across the polished wood. With a few deliberate, careful strokes of my fountain pen, I officially stepped down from my role as the Chief Executive Officer. I handed the absolute operational control of a multi-million-dollar technology and manufacturing empire directly to my only son. Watching Julian sign his name on those corporate transition documents was the single proudest moment of my 72 years on this earth. He did not inherit this massive empire simply because of nepotism or blind luck. He earned the keys to the kingdom through fire and blood. He proved his absolute loyalty, his brilliant strategic mind, and his unwavering moral compass when he ruthlessly dismantled his own toxic marriage to protect our family from predators. He was no longer just a sharp corporate lawyer making a salary. He was a king officially taking his rightful throne. But a newly crowned king needs to expand his borders and mark his territory. And Julian had a brilliant, viciously poetic plan for his very first official act as the new chief executive of our company. Richard's manufacturing plant, the massive industrial facility that had once fueled Chloe's arrogant luxury lifestyle, had not survived the federal seizure. When the government receivers finished auditing the catastrophic financial damage caused by Richard's mass identity theft and offshore embezzlement, they immediately placed the entire property on the commercial auction block to liquidate the assets. The building was completely abandoned. The heavy steel chains still hung securely on the front doors. The massive hydraulic presses inside were gathering thick layers of dust. It was a giant dead concrete dinosaur sitting on valuable city land just waiting to be sold for cheap scraps. Julian and I attended the closed commercial bankruptcy auction together. We sat quietly in the back row of the crowded municipal room. When the bidding officially opened for Richard's foreclosed factory, Julian did not hesitate for a single second. Because the factory machinery was already heavily encumbered by the technological liens from our proprietary bypass valves, no other corporate buyer in the room wanted to touch it. The property was commercially radioactive to absolutely anyone but us. Julian calmly raised his numbered bidding paddle and purchased the entire manufacturing facility, the land, the concrete building, and all the machinery for absolute pennies on the dollar. He bought the entire fallen kingdom of the arrogant white man who had maliciously crushed my father's antique watch for less than the cost of a luxury yacht. We drove our cars to the factory the very next morning. We stood side by side in the massive, empty asphalt parking lot, the exact spot where Richard had been violently pulled from his luxury sedan and arrested by federal tactical agents. We looked up at the giant faded metal letters spelling out his disgraced company name across the high brick facade. I asked Julian what he wanted to do with the massive space. I asked him if he wanted to restart the hydraulic press assembly lines and fold the facility into our existing manufacturing portfolio to increase our quarterly profits. Julian slowly shook his head. He looked at the massive dead concrete building and told me that he did not want to build more machine parts. He wanted to build something that would actually change the trajectory of the world. He told me he wanted to build a permanent living legacy for his mother. My late wife Vivica had always been the strong, beating heart and the moral compass of our family. She was a black woman of profound wisdom, fierce grace, and endless generosity. Before she passed away, she used to tell Julian and me that our massive wealth meant absolutely nothing if we did not use it to lift up the people coming up behind us in the struggle. She knew the heartbreaking struggles of brilliant young black kids growing up in the overlooked neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. Kids who possessed the incredible minds of aerospace engineers and software scientists, but completely lacked the financial resources to even step foot on a prestigious college campus. Julian looked at the dead silent factory and saw a massive blank canvas. He saw the perfect poetic opportunity to turn the ultimate symbol of white corporate arrogance into a towering beacon of black excellence and limitless opportunity. Within 30 days, the heavy demolition crews arrived at the property. They tore down Richard's old company sign and threw the metal letters directly into a rusted dumpster. They gutted the lavish executive offices where Richard had arrogantly forged the shadow loans that ruined his life. They cleared out the old dirty assembly lines and completely redesigned the entire interior space from the ground up. Julian and I poured millions of dollars from the auction savings directly into the aggressive renovation project. We completely transformed the dark, sweaty factory floor into a state-of-the-art technology and engineering incubator. We built pristine modern laboratories, high-tech robotics workshops, collaborative study halls, and a massive digital library. The building became completely unrecognizable. It went from being a dark monument to corporate greed to becoming a brilliant, well-lit sanctuary for groundbreaking innovation. But the physical building was only the beginning of the master plan. Julian and I worked with our legal team to establish a massive, irrevocable charitable trust. We officially named it the Vivica Rollins Memorial Scholarship Foundation. We seeded the foundation with $20 million of our own private capital. The mission of the foundation was simple, but incredibly powerful. We aggressively sought out the most brilliant, underprivileged young black minds in the city. We looked for the kids who were deeply fascinated by mechanical engineering, fluid dynamics, and software development, but were trapped in failing, underfunded school districts. We offered them comprehensive, full-ride university scholarships with zero strings attached. We paid their university tuition, their housing costs, and their daily living expenses so they could focus entirely on their education without the suffocating heavy weight of generational poverty holding them back. Furthermore, we guaranteed every single scholarship recipient a paid summer internship and a dedicated creative workspace inside the newly renovated Technology Center. We gave these kids direct access to the absolute best engineering equipment, the most successful industry mentors, and the absolute freedom to invent and create their own patents. We were not just handing out charity checks. We were actively building the next generation of powerful black engineers who would eventually patent their own technology and build their own massive empires. We were ensuring that no brilliant black child would ever have to crawl under a sweltering, dangerous machine in a hostile factory just to get a tiny foot in the door, the way I had to do so many decades ago. On the day of the grand opening, the massive new facility was gleaming beautifully in the bright morning sun. The freshly paved parking lot was completely filled with local community leaders, brilliant young students, and their incredibly proud weeping parents. Julian and I stood shoulder to shoulder on a temporary wooden stage built right in front of the main entrance. The heavy police chains and the neon orange foreclosure notice were long gone. In their place, mounted proudly above the pristine automatic glass doors, was a beautiful, massive, brushed steel sign. It read, "The Vivica Rollins Center for Advanced Engineering." I looked out at the massive cheering crowd. I saw dozens of young, bright, beautiful faces looking up at us with absolute hope and fierce, relentless determination. They were the future. They were the unstoppable, brilliant force that would carry our family legacy forward for the next 100 years. I thought about Richard sitting in his tiny, cold federal prison cell, completely stripped of his dignity and his powerful name. I thought about Chloe scrubbing floors in a minimum wage job somewhere completely forgotten by the wealthy world she used to worship. They had tried to humiliate us. They had tried to stomp on our history and erase our dignity because they thought our skin color made us weak. But their pure toxic hatred had only served as the exact explosive fuel we needed to build an absolute masterpiece. Julian stepped up to the microphone and delivered a beautiful, incredibly powerful speech about his mother. He spoke about resilience, about the vital importance of community, and about the undeniable world-changing power of education. When he finally finished speaking, the entire crowd erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. He turned to me and smiled. It was the calm, confident smile of a man who had completely conquered his dark past and permanently secured his bright future. We had taken the absolute worst the world had to offer, and we had transformed it into a towering, unbreakable fortress of generational power. The humiliation was completely dead. The true legacy of the Rollins family was fully and permanently restored. There is a profound and beautiful stillness that settles over a massive battlefield when the heavy smoke finally clears and the enemy is completely vanquished. It was a late Friday evening, and the warm Chicago summer breeze was blowing gently through the large oak trees in my quiet working-class neighborhood. I was sitting in my favorite wooden rocking chair on my front porch. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a premium hand-rolled Cuban cigar. I clipped the end with a small silver cutter, struck a wooden match, and took a long, slow draw. The rich, heavy smoke curled beautifully into the twilight air, catching the pale light of the street lamps. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, listening to the peaceful, comforting sounds of the evening cicadas. I had spent my entire life fighting. I fought through the bitter, violent racism of my youth. I fought to build my massive engineering empire from the absolute dirt. And I fought to protect my only son from a family of arrogant parasites who tried to bleed our legacy dry. Now the long, exhausting fighting was completely over. The massive, invisible fortress I had built was entirely secure. Julian was running a powerful, charitable foundation, and our generational wealth was protected forever from greedy hands. I was just an old mechanic, enjoying the absolute silence of a hard-won victory. But the universe always has a way of delivering one final, perfectly timed punchline to a very long joke. As I sat there enjoying the rich flavor of my cigar, the quiet evening was violently interrupted by the sound of tires screeching heavily around the corner of my street. A rusted, beat-up sedan swerved wildly and slammed hard into the concrete curb directly across from my front yard. The driver's side door flew open and Beatrice stumbled out onto the pavement. She was completely, utterly unrecognizable. The wealthy, arrogant country club socialite who used to wear imported pearl necklaces and sip expensive vintage champagne was entirely gone. She was wearing dirty gray sweatpants and a stained, oversized shirt that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her expensive blonde hair was a tangled, matted mess, blowing wildly in the wind. She was clutching a half-empty bottle of cheap brown liquor in her trembling hand. She had lost her massive luxury mansion, she had lost her multi-million-dollar manufacturing company, and her husband Richard was currently rotting in a cold federal prison cell, awaiting trial. Her fragile, entitled mind had completely snapped under the crushing, suffocating weight of her own absolute failure. She pointed her shaking finger directly at me and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She screamed that I had stolen her perfect life. She screamed that I was a monster who had ruined her family, but her venomous words did not carry any power anymore. They were just the pathetic, desperate noises of a broken, completely defeated woman standing in the street gutter. I did not stand up from my chair. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I did not even take the cigar out of my mouth. I simply sat in my rocking chair, taking another slow draw, and watched her perform her final miserable dramatic act. She had completely forgotten about the strict federal restraining order a judge had placed on her just a few weeks ago. But the local city police department had certainly not forgotten. Before she could even take 3 stumbling steps onto my green front lawn, the silent flashing blue and red lights of 2 police cruisers flooded the dark street. They had been patrolling the neighborhood specifically because my private security team had digitally flagged her license plate the exact moment she crossed into the residential district. 4 heavily armed officers stepped quickly out of their vehicles and immediately surrounded her on the sidewalk. Beatrice tried to physically fight them. She swung her weak arms and screamed hysterically about her elite social status, demanding that they arrest the old black man on the porch instead. The police officers did not care about her imaginary wealth or her arrogant white privilege. They grabbed her arms, forced them roughly behind her back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. I watched quietly from my porch as they pushed her forcefully into the back of the police cruiser. She pressed her tear-stained, terrified face against the reinforced glass, staring directly at me as the police car drove away into the dark night. That was the very last time I ever saw her face. She was going straight to a county jail cell, entirely stripped of her fake royalty, her unearned pride, and her complete freedom. As for her daughter Chloe, the universe had delivered a completely different kind of slow, painful, poetic justice. When you build your entire personality and identity on the money you steal from other hardworking people, you have absolutely no survival skills when you are finally thrown out into the real, cold world. A few days ago, my private investigator sent me a final brief background report on her current whereabouts just to close her file completely. She was not living a glamorous life in California. She had not found another wealthy corporate lawyer to manipulate and bleed dry. The devastating public exposure of her fake pregnancy and her desperate federal extortion attempt on my front lawn had made her completely radioactive to any respectable man with a bank account. She was currently living in a cramped, dirty room at a cheap weekly motel on the dangerous industrial edge of the city. To pay for her weekly rent and her basic groceries, she had been forced to take the absolute only job that would hire a woman with no practical skills and a massive, embarrassing gap in her employment history. She was working the grueling graveyard shift as a sanitation worker at a massive discount supermarket. The arrogant woman who used to throw lavish, catered birthday parties and scream at my private security guards was now wearing a cheap, stiff polyester uniform name tag. She spent her long, miserable nights pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket down the bright fluorescent aisles, scrubbing sticky spilled soda and dirt off the cheap linoleum floor. She was taking strict orders from a 19-year-old shift manager who did not care at all about her expensive tastes or her superior attitude. Every single time she wiped down a filthy public toilet or hauled a heavy leaking bag of rotting garbage out to the dark alley dumpster, she was forced to remember the $10 million estate she had so foolishly thrown away. She was finally experiencing the exact same hard, back-breaking, blue-collar labor she had mocked me for doing my entire life. She was serving a long, bitter life sentence of absolute mediocrity and crushing daily regret. I took one final deep draw of my Cuban cigar and slowly exhaled the thick smoke into the cool night air. I looked up at the bright, shining stars hanging beautifully over the massive city of Chicago. I thought about my brilliant, beautiful wife, Vivica. I smiled a deep, peaceful, profoundly satisfied smile that reached the very bottom of my soul. We had survived the long, bitter storm. The bloodline of the ultimate survivors had permanently won the war. We had taken the absolute worst arrogance the world had to offer, and we had turned it into a solid, towering foundation of undeniable generational power. The garbage had successfully taken itself out, and my home was finally perfectly clean. Respect is the silent currency of the wise, but arrogance is the loud bankruptcy of the foolish. When you look down on someone based on their clothes, their age, or the color of their skin, you are blinding yourself to the power they hold. Never bite the hand that built the ground you stand on. Entitlement creates an illusion of invincibility, but reality is a brutal collector that always comes for its debt. True strength does not need to shout in a crowded room, it simply executes the right moves in silence. Protect your legacy, guard your heart, and let the trash take itself out. Thank you for watching this story of ultimate justice. Have you ever had to deal with entitled or toxic in-laws who severely underestimated your worth? Tell me your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more satisfying stories where arrogance meets reality. Stay strong and always know your true value.